Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey back to a time when women had no alarm clocks, no smartphones, no watches ticking on their wrists. Imagine waking up not because of a blaring ringtone, but because golden light kissed your eyelids. Imagine knowing it was time to start dinner, not by checking the time, but by watching your own shadow stretch long across the ground. How did women organize their entire lives without ever knowing if it was 3:15 or 4:30? How did they meet friends, finish tasks, or even know when to sleep? Tonight, we are stepping into their world. A world where the sun was not just a ball of fire in the sky, but a faithful companion, a silent guide, and yes, the most reliable clock a woman could ever have. So before we walk together into this sunlit past, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to this channel and give this video a like, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we are exploring together. I want your support to feel real, not forced. And hey, I am curious. Where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you tucked into bed in New York, watching the sunrise in California? Or maybe you are on the other side of the world altogether. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are and what time it is for you right now. I find it beautiful that we can share this moment across so many different clocks. Now, let us dim the lights just a little. Let the room fall soft and quiet, and step back in time together. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. It is somewhere around the year 1300. You are a woman living in a small village in England. There is no electricity, no phones, no clocks on the wall. You do not own a watch. In fact, you have never even seen one. When you wake up in the morning, you do not reach for your phone to check the time. Instead, you open your eyes and the first thing you notice is light. Pale, delicate, just beginning to creep through the cracks in the wooden shutters of your home. That light tells you everything. It whispers, it is time, the day is beginning. You do not need an alarm. Your body already knows. You've been waking with the dawn for so long that your entire being is tuned to it, like a musical instrument perfectly in sync with the world around you. You rise, stretch, feel the coolness of the morning air on your skin. Outside, a rooster crows, not because he's been programmed or trained, but because he too is part of this ancient rhythm. The sun is rising, and so the world wakes up. Now, let us pause here for a second, because this is important. We often think of people in the past as less organized, less efficient, maybe even less intelligent than we are today. But that's not true. These women were not stumbling around in confusion. They were deeply, almost magically, connected to something we have lost. They could read the language of light. They could look at the sky and know with astonishing accuracy what part of the day it was, and more than that, they knew what to do with that information. Let me give you an example. Historians who study medieval life tell us that the average woman in the 1300s could estimate the time of day within about 30 minutes just by observing the position of the sun and the length of her own shadow. 30 minutes without a clock. Think about that for a second. Could you do that today? Could you step outside right now, look at the sun, glance at your shadow and tell me if it is 2 o'clock or 2:30? Most of us could not. We have outsourced that skill to our devices, but these women, they carried that knowledge in their bones. Here is how it worked. In the early morning, when the sun was low on the horizon, shadows were long, impossibly long. If you stood outside your home and saw your shadow stretching out before you, tall and thin like a giant version of yourself, you knew it was early. Time to light the fire. Time to prepare the first meal, time to wake the children. As the morning progressed, the sun climbed higher and shadows grew shorter. By the time your shadow was only about twice your own height, you knew it was mid-morning. Time to start the heavier work. Time to carry water from the well. Time to tend the animals. And then came what these women thought of as the golden hours. This was the middle of the day, when the sun was almost directly overhead. Your shadow shrank to nearly nothing, a small dark puddle at your feet. This was noon, or close to it, the heat of the day, the brightest light. In many cultures, this was the time to pause, to rest, to eat the largest meal. Not because a clock told them to, but because their bodies and the world around them told them to. The sun was at its peak. Energy was at its peak, it made sense. But here is where it gets really interesting. As the afternoon stretched on, the sun began its slow descent. Shadows grew long again, but now they stretched in the opposite direction. If your morning shadow pointed west, your afternoon shadow pointed east. And women used this. They used it to measure the hours, to know when to start preparing the evening meal, when to call the children in from play, when to begin the tasks that needed to be finished before darkness fell. There is a wonderful account from a medieval text, a manual for household management written in the 1400s, that describes how a housewife should organize her day. It does not say at 9 o'clock do this. It says, when the sun has risen the height of a spear above the horizon, begin your baking. When your shadow is no longer than your arm, it is time to prepare the midday meal. When the sun touches the western hills, bring the animals inside. Do you see the difference? Time was not something abstract, something separated from life. It was woven into life. It was part of the fabric of existence. The sun did not just light the day, it structured the day. It gave shape and meaning and rhythm to everything. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what about cloudy days? What about winter, when the sun barely shows up at all? Great question. And yes, cloudy days were harder. Women could not rely on shadows when there were no shadows to see. But even then, they were not lost. They had other cues. The quality of light, for example. Even on a cloudy day, light changes throughout the day. Morning light has a certain softness, a greyness. Midday light, even through clouds, is brighter, more diffused. Evening light dims, grows heavier. Women learned to read these subtleties. They had to. And in winter, when days were short and the sun hung low in the sky even at noon, women adjusted. They worked with what they had. They knew that a winter day was different from a summer day, and the Say did not fight that. They accepted it. They adapted. In the winter, there was simply less daylight to work with, so they did less outdoor work. They focused on tasks that could be done by firelight, sewing, spinning, mending. They were not trying to squeeze 24 hours of productivity out of a 10-hour day. They were living in harmony with the rhythm of the earth. And here is something beautiful. Because women were so connected to the sun, they were also deeply connected to the seasons. They could feel the days lengthening in spring, sense the shift in the angle of the light. They knew, without a calendar, that summer was coming because the sun was rising earlier and setting later. They could feel it. And when autumn arrived, when the days began to shorten again, they felt that too. It was a signal, a reminder. Winter is coming. Prepare. This is so different from how we live today. We have the same amount of daylight in our lives, technically, but we do not feel it in the same way. We turn on lights when it gets dark. We wake up to alarms, not to the sun. We eat lunch at 12:30, not because our shadows tell us to, but because that's when our lunch break is scheduled. We have gained so much in terms of control and precision, but we have lost something too. We have lost that intimate connection with the natural world, that sense of being part of a larger rhythm. Let me tell you about a woman named Agnes. Agnes is not a real person, but she is based on historical records of women who lived in rural England in the 1300s. Agnes wakes up when the first light of dawn filters through the gaps in her thatched roof. She does not know the exact hour, and she does not need to. She knows it is morning, and that is enough. She climbs out of bed, wraps a shawl around her shoulders, and steps outside. The air is cool, almost cold. She takes a deep breath, looks up at the sky. It is clear. Good. That means she can work outside today. She walks to the well, draws water, carries it back to her home. The sun is just beginning to peek over the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Agnes loves this time of day. It is quiet, peaceful. The world feels new. By the time she has lit the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of bread and ale, the sun is fully up. She glances outside, sees her shadow, and nods to herself. Time to wake the children. Time to start the day's work. Agnes spends the morning in her garden, pulling weeds, checking on the vegetables. She does not wear a watch. She does not need to. Every so often she pauses, looks at the sun, gauges her shadow. She knows instinctively how much time has passed, how much time she has left before she needs to start preparing the midday meal. And when her shadow is just about the length of her forearm, she wipes her hands on her apron and heads back inside. This is not chaos. This is not disorganization. This is a woman who is completely, beautifully in tune with the world around her. She does not feel rushed. She does not feel behind. She is simply moving through her day at the pace the sun sets for her. And there is a kind of peace in that, a kind of freedom that many of us have forgotten exists. Now, I am not saying we should all throw away our clocks and live by the sun. That would be impractical in the modern world and honestly a little absurd. But I do think there is something we can learn from Agnes and women like her. Maybe it is about slowing down. Maybe it is about paying attention to the natural rhythms that still exist, even if we ignore them. The way light changes throughout the day, the way our energy ebbs and flows, the way our bodies want to wake with the light and rest with the dark. Modern science actually backs this up. Researchers have found that our bodies have something called a circadian rhythm, a natural 24-hour cycle that regulates our sleep, our energy, our mood. And this rhythm is primarily influenced by light. When we expose ourselves to natural light, especially in the morning, it helps regulate our internal clock. It tells our bodies, it is time to be awake, it is time to be alert. And when we avoid light in the evening, it tells our bodies, it is time to wind down, it is time to rest. But here is the thing, most of us do not live this way anymore. We wake up in the dark, turn on bright artificial lights, stare at screens that emit blue light late into the night. We are constantly overriding our natural rhythms, fighting against them, trying to bend time to our will. And then we wonder why we are tired all the time, why we feel disconnected, why we struggle with sleep. Medieval women did not have this problem, not because they were smarter or healthier, but because they did not have a choice. They had to live according to the sun. And in doing so, they lived in a way that was actually better for their bodies, better for their mental health, better for their sense of connection to the world. So here is my question for you. What would it look like to bring just a little bit of that back into your life? What if just once this week you tried waking up with the sun instead of to an alarm? What if you stepped outside in the morning and just stood there for a moment feeling the light on your face, noticing your shadow, letting yourself be present in that moment? What if you paid attention to how the light changes throughout the day and noticed how it makes you feel? I am not saying you have to become a medieval peasant, but maybe, just maybe, there is wisdom in the way they lived. Wisdom we have forgotten, wisdom we could use. As the sun sets on this first part of our journey, I want you to imagine one more thing. Imagine Agnes again at the end of her long day. The sun is low now, nearly touching the horizon. The sky is painted in shades of orange and purple. Agnes stands outside her home watching. She does not have a television to turn on, a phone to scroll through. She just watches the sun go down, and as it disappears below the horizon, she knows the day is over. It is time to rest. There is something so simple, so profound about that. The sun gave her her day, and now the sun is taking it back, and she is okay with that. She is at peace, Poi. But the sun was not the only clock in a woman's life. Oh no, there was another timekeeper. One that echoed through the silence of medieval villages. One that could be heard from miles away. One that brought entire communities together in a shared sense of time. And that is where we are going next. So stay with me, because in just a moment, we are going to talk about the sound that structured the lives of millions of women. The sound of bells. Picture this sound echoing across the countryside. A deep, resonant clang that cuts through the morning mist. Then another, and another. 7 times, 8 times. The sound travels over fields, through forests, into the windows of every home within miles. And every woman who hears it knows exactly what it means. It is not just a sound. It is an announcement. It is a command. It is time. Welcome to the world of church bells, the public clock that governed medieval life for centuries. If the sun was a woman's personal timekeeper, then the bells were the voice of the entire community, calling everyone to the same rhythm, the same schedule, the same shared experience of time. And for women, these bells were not just background noise, they were the framework around which an entire day, an entire life was built. Let me take you back to that same village in England, in the year 1325. Our woman Agnes, who we met earlier, is kneading bread dough in her small kitchen. Her hands work the dough rhythmically, pressing and folding, pressing and folding. Outside, the morning sun is climbing higher. She has already been awake for several hours, but then, cutting through the sound of birds chirping and chickens clucking, comes that sound, the church bell. Not just one ring, but a specific pattern. 3 long peals followed by a pause, then 3 more. Agnes stops what she is doing. She wipes her hands on her apron and glances toward the window. Terse, she thinks, the 3rd hour. It is mid-morning now, time to shift her focus. The bread can wait. There are other tasks that need her attention at this hour. Maybe it is time to go to the well for more water. Maybe it is time to check on the animals. The bell has spoken, and Agnes listens. Now, before we go any further, I need to explain something that might sound a bit strange to modern ears. In medieval times, the day was not divided into 24 equal hours like we have today. Instead, the day was divided into what were called canonical hours, or liturgical hours. These were the times set aside for prayer in monasteries and churches, and there were 7 of them, later 8. Let me list them for you, because their names are beautiful and strange and completely foreign to us now. First came matins, which happened in the deep darkness before dawn, usually around 2 or 3 in the morning. Then came lauds at dawn. Prime was the 1st hour of daylight. Terce was the 3rd hour around mid-morning. Sext was the 6th hour noon. Nons was the 9th hour mid-afternoon. Vespers came at sunset. And finally, Compline, the last prayer of the day, happened just before everyone went to bed. Now, here is the fascinating part. These hours were not fixed to our modern clock. Remember, there were no clocks yet. Instead, these hours were flexible. They stretched and compressed with the seasons. In summer, when daylight lasted longer, each daytime hour was longer. In winter, when days were short, each daytime hour was shorter. A summer hour could be as long as 80 minutes by our modern measurement. A winter hour might be only 40 minutes. Wild, right? But for the people living through it, this made perfect sense. The day was the day. However much light God gave you, that was what you worked with. and the bells divided that light into sections, into manageable chunks of time that everyone could understand and follow. Let me tell you what this actually meant for women. Imagine you are a young mother in a medieval town. You wake to the sound of the Lord's bell at dawn. That is your signal to start the fire, to begin preparing breakfast for your family. A few hours later, the prime bell rings. That is when you know the children need to be sent off to help their father in the fields, or to run errands, or to begin their own small tasks around the house. When the terce bell rings, you know it is time to go to the market. Not because someone told you market starts at 9 o'clock, but because the bell rang, and everyone knows that after terce is market time. At noon, the sext bell rings. This is the middle of the day, time for the main meal, time to rest for a bit in the heat. When the nun's bell rings in mid-afternoon, you know you have a few more hours of daylight left. Better finish the urgent tasks now, and when the vespers bell rings at sunset, that is the signal to bring everything inside, to close up the house, to prepare for the evening meal and the long night ahead. Do you see how this works? The bells created a shared rhythm for the entire community. Everyone heard the same sound at the same time. Everyone moved through the day together. There was no confusion about whether you were early or late because there was no such thing as 3:15 or 4:30. There was only before the nun's bell or after the sex bell. And here is something truly remarkable. Researchers and historians tell us that in the medieval countryside on a quiet day, you could hear church bells from over a mile away. Some accounts say even further, up to 3 or 4 miles if the wind was right. Think about that. The silence of the medieval world was so profound, so complete, that a bell ringing in the centre of a town could be heard by every single person living within a massive radius. No cars, no planes, no sirens or lawnmowers or air conditioners humming, just silence. And into that silence the bell spoke, and everyone listened. There is a wonderful piece of writing from a medieval monk that describes the bells as the voice of God organising time. He writes, and I am paraphrasing here because the original text is in Latin, "The bell calls the faithful to prayer, and in doing so it orders the chaos of the day." Without the bell we would be lost in time, wandering without purpose, but the bell gives us structure. The bell reminds us that time is a gift and we must use it wisely. For women, this structure was both a blessing and a constraint. On one hand, the bells gave them a framework. They knew what was expected at each hour. They could plan their tasks around the bell schedule. If the priest rang the terce bell at a certain time, women knew that was when they should be finishing up morning chores and moving on to the next phase of the day. It created predictability in a world that was often unpredictable. But on the other hand, the bells were also a form of control. The church which rang the bells was dictating when people should pray, when they should work, when they should rest, and women, who often had the least power in medieval society, had no say in when those bells rang. They simply had to obey. This is an important point, and I do not want to gloss over it. The bells were not neutral. They represented authority. They represented the church's power over daily life, and women, along with everyone else, were subject to that power. There is a story I came across in a historical text about a woman in a French village in the 1400s. Her name was Marguerite, and she was known in her town for being an excellent baker. People would come from neighbouring villages to buy her bread. But here is the thing. Marguerite could not just bake whenever she wanted. She had to time her baking around the bells. The oven, which was communal and owned by the lord of the manor, was only available at certain hours, and those hours were determined by the bell schedule. If Marguerite missed the window between terce and sext, she would have to wait until the next day to bake. Her entire livelihood was structured around those bells. Now you might be thinking, okay, but what if the bell ringer was late? What if he forgot? What if the timing was off? Great questions. And yes, that happened. The person responsible for ringing the bells was usually a church official, sometimes a monk, sometimes a sexton, which was a church caretaker. And they were human. They made mistakes. Sometimes they overslept. Sometimes they misjudged the time. And when that happened, it could throw off the entire community. There are records of complaints from medieval townspeople about bell ringers who were not consistent. In one town in Germany, the people actually petitioned the church to replace their bell ringer because he was so unreliable. They said, and this is recorded in the town's archives, "We cannot conduct our affairs properly when the bells ring at different times each day. We need someone who will be faithful to the hours." But here is the interesting part. Even when the bells were inconsistent, they were still the best system available. Because at least everyone in the community heard the same inconsistent bells. If the terce bell rang late, it rang late for everyone. So you might not know the exact hour by some universal standard, but you still knew where you were in relation to everyone else in your town. And that was what mattered most. Let me paint you a picture of how this actually played out in daily life. Imagine a woman named Beatrice, living in a bustling market town in Italy in the year 1400. Beatrice is a widow. She runs a small shop where she sells cloth that she weaves herself. Every morning she wakes to the Lord's bell. She says a quick prayer as is expected, then begins her day. When the prime bell rings, she opens her shop. She knows that other merchants are opening their shops at the same time because they all heard the same bell. Throughout the morning, customers come and go. Beatrice keeps one ear always tuned to the church tower. When the terce bell rings, she knows the morning market rush is about to begin. People who've been working in their gardens or tending animals will now make their way to town. She makes sure her best cloth is displayed prominently. When the sex bell rings at noon, she closes her shop for a break. Again, this is not her decision. This is custom. Everyone closes at sext. The entire town pauses. People go home or to the tavern for the midday meal. The streets empty out. After an hour or so, when people start to drift back, Beatrice reopens. She does not need to check a clock. She just watches the flow of people, listens to the rhythm of the town. When the nun's bell rings in mid-afternoon, she knows she has maybe 2 or 3 more hours of good business before people start heading home. And when the Vespers bell rings at sunset, she closes up shop, sweeps the floor and walks home through streets that are also emptying out, because everyone else heard the same bell and is doing the same thing. There is something almost magical about this, is there not? This synchronization of an entire community through sound. No text messages, no group chats, just a bell ringing out across the rooftops and everyone understanding what it means. But here's where it gets even more interesting. As time went on, especially in the 1400s and 1500s, some towns started to develop what historians call merchant time versus church time. Let me explain. As trade and commerce grew, merchants needed more precise timing. They needed to know exactly when contracts should be signed, when goods should be delivered, when markets opened and closed. The flexible seasonal hours of the church bells were not precise enough for these new economic needs. So some towns started to install mechanical clocks in their town halls or central squares. These clocks divided the day into 24 equal hours regardless of the season. And they rang their own bells. Now you had 2 sets of bells, the church bells ringing the ancient liturgical hours, and the town clock bells ringing the new merchant hours. And women had to learn to navigate both systems. Can you imagine the confusion? You're a woman trying to meet a friend at the market. Does she mean after the terce bell or after the town clock strikes 9? Are you both even listening to the same bells? There are records of people showing up at the wrong time because they were following different bell systems. It is almost comical in a way. The solution to time confusion created more time confusion. But even with all this complexity, the bells remained central to women's lives for centuries. They were the soundtrack of existence. A woman might not remember the exact date of her daughter's birth, but she would remember that it happened just after the Vespers bell rang on a cold evening in winter. Time was not recorded in numbers. It was recorded in sounds, in moments, in experiences tied to those pealing bells. And here is something that touches me deeply. The bells were not just functional, they were also comforting. In a world full of uncertainty, where disease and war and famine were constant threats, the bells were a constant. They rang every day, day after day, year after year. They were a promise that the world was still turning, that God was still watching, that the community was still there. For a lonely woman working in her home, hearing that bell ring out across the valley was a reminder that she was not alone, that she was part of something larger. So what can we learn from this? What does the story of bells tell us about time and community and women's lives? I think it tells us that time is not just a personal experience, it is also a communal one. We need shared rhythms. We need to know that others are moving through the day with us. And maybe, just maybe, we have lost some of that in our modern world, where everyone has their own personal schedule, their own alarm, their own time zone on their phone. What would it be like if we had something like those bells today? Not literally, of course, but some kind of shared signal that brought us all into the same rhythm, even just for a moment. Some reminder that we are part of a community, not just isolated individuals racing through our own private timelines. The bells taught women patience. They taught presence. They taught the art of waiting for the right moment, the right hour, the right bell. And they taught that time was not something to be hoarded or controlled, but something to be shared. But those bells were not the only timekeeper woven into the fabric of a woman's life. There was another clock, one even more intimate, even more personal, one that ticked inside her very body, one that connected her not to the church or the sun, but to the moon, to the tides, to the ancient rhythms of fertility and life itself. And that is where our story turns next. So stay close, because we're about to explore the most secret, the most powerful timekeeper a woman has ever known. There was a clock that no one could see, a clock that did not ring bells or cast shadows, a clock that lived inside the body of every woman, ticking away in a rhythm so ancient, so fundamental that it connected her to the very forces that govern the earth itself. This clock was her menstrual cycle. And long before science gave it a name, long before we understood hormones or ovulation, women knew this rhythm intimately. They felt it. They lived by it. They organized their lives around it. This is going to be a different kind of conversation, a more personal one. Because we are about to talk about something that was rarely written down in history books, something that happened in the private spaces of women's lives. But make no mistake, this was one of the most powerful timekeeping systems a woman possessed. Her body was not just a vessel, it was a calendar, a predictor, a guide. Let me start with something that might surprise you. Modern science has discovered that women do not just have a circadian rhythm, that 24-hour cycle we talked about with the sun. Women have a second biological clock called an infradian rhythm. Infra means beyond, so infradian means beyond a day. This rhythm lasts approximately 28 days, the length of a typical menstrual cycle, and it affects everything: energy levels, appetite, sleep, mood, physical strength, creativity, everything. But here is the extraordinary part. Women in ancient times did not need scientists to tell them this. They already knew. They knew because they paid attention. They listened to their bodies in a way that we have largely forgotten how to do. Imagine a woman in ancient Greece. Let us call her Theodora. Theodora is 23 years old. She lives in Athens in the year 400 before the Common Era. She is married. She has one small child, and like all women of her time, she spends a significant portion of her day working with wool, spinning it into thread, weaving it into cloth. This is not just a hobby. This is essential work. Her family needs clothing. Her household needs blankets, tapestries, coverings, and Theodora provides them. But here is what historians have pieced together from various sources. Women like Theodora did not work at the same pace all month long. They could not. Their bodies would not let them. Instead, they worked in waves, in cycles, and they knew, without any scientific terminology, that some weeks they had more energy than others. Some weeks their hands were faster, their minds sharper, their productivity higher, and other weeks they needed to slow down. Let me break this down for you, because it is fascinating. The menstrual cycle has 4 distinct phases. First is the menstrual phase when bleeding occurs. This typically lasts about 3 to 7 days. Then comes the follicular phase, which lasts about 7 to 10 days after menstruation ends. During this phase, estrogen levels rise. Then comes ovulation, a brief window of about 1 to 2 days when an egg is released. And finally the luteal phase, which lasts about 12 to 14 days, during which progesterone dominates. Then the cycle begins again. Now each of these phases affects a woman's body and mind differently. During the follicular phase, when estrogen is rising, women tend to feel energized, optimistic, strong. Their verbal skills are sharper. Their ability to learn new things is enhanced. They feel more social, more outgoing. This is the body's way of saying you are approaching your fertile window. Go out, meet people, be active. Then comes ovulation. Energy peaks, confidence peaks. This is when a woman feels most powerful, most capable. Her body is literally designed to feel its best during these few days. And then, after ovulation, things shift. Progesterone rises during the luteal phase. The body starts to slow down. Women feel more introspective, more tired. They crave comfort, rest, solitude. They might feel more emotional, more sensitive. And this is not weakness. This is the body preparing for either pregnancy or menstruation. Either way, it is time to conserve energy. Ancient women did not have textbooks explaining all of this, but they noticed patterns. Theodora noticed that some weeks she could sit at her loom for hours, her fingers flying, her mind completely absorbed in the intricate patterns she was creating. And other weeks, the same work felt exhausting. Her back ached more. Her eyes grew tired faster. She needed more breaks. And you know what? She listened. She did not force herself to maintain the same pace all month long, because she did not have a boss telling her she needed to hit the same productivity targets every single day. She worked with her rhythm, not against it. There is evidence from ancient Greek art, vast paintings that show women engaged in wool work, and scholars who study these images have noticed something interesting. Many of the scenes depict women working in groups, multiple women gathered together spinning or weaving, and historians believe that part of the reason for this was the menstrual cycle. When a woman was in her lower energy phase, having other women around meant the work could still get done. It was a natural form of support. If Theodora was having a slow week, her sister or her friend could pick up the pace, and next month, when Theodora was in her high energy phase, she could return the favour. This is so different from how we operate today. We are expected to perform at the same level every single day. The modern workplace does not care if you are in your follicular phase or your luteal phase. You have the same deadlines, the same meetings, the same expectations. And when women feel tired or less productive during certain weeks, they often blame themselves. They think something is wrong with them. But nothing is wrong. Their bodies are doing exactly what they are designed to do. It is the system that refuses to acknowledge the rhythm. let me tell you about something researchers discovered recently. A team of scientists studied women's sleep and activity patterns over several months using wearable devices, and they found that women's sleep-wake rhythms actually change throughout the menstrual cycle. During the follicular phase, women tend to wake up feeling more rested. They fall asleep more easily. During the luteal phase, especially in the days before menstruation, sleep quality decreases. Women wake up more during the night. They feel groggier in the morning. The body temperature is slightly elevated, which affects sleep. Ancient women noticed this too. They knew there were nights when sleep came easily and nights when it did not, and they planned accordingly. If a woman knew from experience that she always struggled to sleep in the days before her bleeding began, she might schedule lighter tasks for those days. She would not plan a major trip or a demanding project. She would give herself grace. Now, I want to talk about something even more profound. The connection between the menstrual cycle and time itself. Have you ever wondered why the average menstrual cycle is about 28 days? And have you ever noticed that the lunar cycle, the time it takes for the moon to go from new moon to full moon and back to new moon, is about 29.5 days? That is remarkably close. Throughout history, cultures all over the world have noticed this connection. They called menstruation moon time or moon blood. They associated women's cycles with the cycles of the moon. And while modern science is still debating whether there is a direct causal link, the correlation is undeniable. Something about the rhythm of the moon echoes in the rhythm of women's bodies. In many ancient cultures, women would gather during their menstruation. They would retreat to special huts or the designated spaces. And while some of this was due to taboos about menstruation being unclean, which is unfortunate and unfair, there was also another aspect to it. These gatherings were times of rest, times when women could step away from their daily labour and be together. They would share stories, share knowledge, support one another. In a way, their cycles synchronized not just with the moon, but with each other. There is actually a phenomenon called menstrual synchrony, where women who spend a lot of time together start to have their cycles align. A study from 1971 by a researcher named Martha McClintock found that women living in close quarters, like college dormitories, often developed synchronized cycles. Now, this research has been debated and challenged over the years, but many women can tell you from personal experience that it happens. There is something about being in close community with other women that affects the rhythm. Imagine what this meant in ancient villages. Imagine a group of 10 or 15 women, all living near each other, all spending their days together, working, talking, helping one another. Over time, their cycles might begin to align. And when menstruation came, it came for many of them at once. The whole community would shift. The men would take on more of the outdoor labour, the children would be sent to help their fathers, and the women would rest. Or at least they would do lighter work. And there was no shame in this. It was simply part of the natural rhythm of life. But here is where it gets really interesting from a time management perspective. Because women experience this cycle every month, they developed an intuitive sense of time passing that men did not have. A woman did not need a calendar to tell her that roughly a month had passed since the last full moon. Her body told her, she could feel it. There are accounts from indigenous cultures, from Native American tribes, from African communities, from Aboriginal Australians, of women using their menstrual cycles as a way to track time. A woman might say, "That happened 3 moons ago," meaning 3 menstrual cycles ago, meaning roughly 3 months. Or she might say, "I will see you again in 2 moons, meaning in about 2 months. The cycle was the calendar. Pregnancy, of course, was measured the same way. 9 moons. A woman did not need a doctor to tell her she was 9 months pregnant. She knew because 9 cycles had passed since her last menstruation. Her body was the clock. Her body was the calendar, and she trusted it completely. Now, let us talk about the practical implications of this. How did this internal clock help women organize their days? Well, think about it this way. If you know that you have about 28 days between each menstruation, and you know that certain tasks are easier during certain phases of your cycle, you can plan ahead. You can schedule the heavy work, the difficult projects, the intense labor for your high-energy weeks, and you can schedule the detail-oriented work, the planning, the reflective tasks for your lower-energy weeks. There is a movement today called cycle syncing, where modern women are rediscovering this ancient wisdom. They are tracking their cycles and adjusting their work, their exercise, their social activities accordingly. During the follicular phase, they schedule important meetings, challenging workouts, social events, or events. During the luteal phase, they focus on completing projects, doing administrative work, spending time alone or with close friends. And during menstruation, they rest. They say no to extra commitments. They honor their body's need for recovery. This is not a new idea. This is what women did for thousands of years. But somewhere along the way, we forgot. Or rather, we were told to forget. We were told that our cycles were a problem, an inconvenience, something to hide or suppress or override with medication. We were told to push through, to ignore the signals our bodies were sending, to perform at the same level every single day regardless of where we were in our cycle. And the cost of that has been enormous. Burnout, exhaustion, hormonal imbalances, mental health struggles, because we are fighting against our nature instead of working with it. So here is my question for you, and I am genuinely curious. If you are a woman, do you pay attention to your cycle? Do you notice patterns in your energy, your mood, your productivity? And if you do not track it, what would happen if you started? Just for 1 month, just as an experiment, what if you kept a simple journal? Nothing fancy, just a note each day about how you feel, and then, at the end of the month, look back. See if you notice any patterns. I think you might be surprised by what you discover. And if you are a man listening to this, I hope this gives you insight into the women in your life, your partner, your mother, your sister, your friends. Understanding this rhythm is not just about biology. It is about empathy. It is about recognizing that time does not feel the same to everyone all the time, and that is okay. That is human. The women of the past understood something we are only just beginning to remember, that our bodies are wise, that they carry ancient knowledge, that they connect us to rhythms far older and far more powerful than any clock on the wall. And when we ignore those rhythms, we lose something essential. We lose our connection to ourselves. But the body's internal rhythm was not the only celestial guide women looked to, because every night, when the sun set and darkness fell, there was another companion in the sky. One that changed shape slowly, predictably, beautifully. One that seemed to mirror the very cycle we just talked about. And women did not just observe it, they lived by it. So let us step outside now, into the cool night air, and look up, because the moon has stories to tell us too. She stepped out into the darkness, and there it was, silver, luminous, hanging in the velvet sky like a pearl on invisible thread. The moon, not harsh like the sun, not commanding like the church bells, but gentle, constant, a companion that walked with her through the night, that changed its face slowly over the course of weeks, that seemed to understand something about her that even she did not fully grasp. For thousands of years, women looked up at the moon and saw themselves reflected back. They saw cycles, they saw transformation, they saw a timekeeper that moved to a rhythm so similar to their own bodies that it could not be coincidence. The moon was not just something beautiful to admire, it was a clock, a calendar, a guide through the invisible architecture of time. Let me take you to ancient Egypt, to the banks of the Nile River, around the year 1500 before the Common Era. Meet Nefertari. She is not the famous queen, just an ordinary woman, a farmer's wife with 3 children, but Nefertari possesses knowledge that has been passed down through generations of women in her family. Knowledge about the moon. Every evening, after the sun sets and the scorching heat of the day finally releases its grip on the land, Nefertari steps outside her mud brick home. She looks up, she finds the moon, and she reads it the way you or I might read a clock on the wall. Is it a thin crescent barely visible? Then it is early in the lunar month, the new beginning. Is it full, round, glowing with such brightness that it casts shadows on the ground? Then it is the middle of the month, the peak. Is it waning, growing smaller each night? Then the month is coming to an end, time to prepare for the cycle to begin again. The ancient Egyptians had a deep reverence for the moon. They associated it with the god Thoth, the god of wisdom, writing, and time itself. But in the everyday lives of women, the moon was something more personal, more intimate. It was the marker by which they measured their pregnancies, their planting seasons, their menstrual cycles, their lives. Nefertari knows, without anyone having to tell her, it takes approximately 29.5 days for the moon to complete one full cycle, from new moon to new moon. And she knows that this is almost exactly the length of her own monthly cycle. 28, 29, 30 days. Close enough that the connection feels undeniable. Some months, her bleeding begins right at the new moon, when the sky is darkest. Other months it arrives at the full moon, when the light is brightest. But always, she can look up at the moon and know roughly where she is in her own cycle. And this knowledge is practical, deeply practical. Let me explain why. Nefertari is pregnant. This is her 4th child. And someone asks her, when will the baby come? She does not have a due date calculated by a doctor. She does not have an ultrasound photo with numbers and measurements. Instead, she looks up at the moon and counts. She knows she stopped bleeding 9 moons ago, 9 lunar cycles. So the baby will come around the time of the next full moon, give or take a few days, and you know what? She is almost always right, because 9 lunar months is roughly 266 days, which is very close to the average human gestation period of 280 days. Women all over the ancient world used this same system. 9 moons, not 9 months on a Roman calendar or a modern calendar. 9 moons, mean times, watching the moon grow full and then disappear and then grow full again. It was elegant, it was simple, and it worked. There is something profound about measuring pregnancy in moons rather than months, because moons are visible, they are tangible. A woman could stand outside every night and watch her pregnancy progress in the sky. The moon became a companion through those long 9 cycles, a reminder that she was not alone, that the universe itself was moving through this journey with her. In ancient Rome, midwives kept track of their clients' pregnancies using lunar calendars. There is a surviving Roman text, a medical manuscript from around the 2nd century of the Common Era, that instructs midwives to mark the day of the last menstruation and then count forward 9 lunar months. It also suggests that women who go into labour during the full moon tend to have faster deliveries, while women who labour during the new moon might experience longer, more difficult births. Now, whether there is any truth to that is debatable. Modern research has not found strong evidence for it, but the fact that they were tracking it, that they were paying attention to the lunar phases and looking for patterns, tells us how central the moon was to their understanding of time and birth. But the moon was not just a calendar for pregnancy, it was also a guide for agriculture, for festivals, for rituals, for community life. In ancient Greece, many important festivals were tied to the lunar calendar. The full moon was considered an auspicious time for celebrations, for weddings, for gatherings. The new moon was a time for new beginnings, for making plans, for setting intentions. Women planned their work around these lunar festivals. If there was a big celebration coming at the full moon, they would spend the days before preparing food, weaving new cloth for special garments, cleaning their homes. The moon gave structure to the social calendar in the same way the church bells gave structure to the daily schedule. Let me tell you about a festival that might blow your mind a little bit. In ancient Athens, there was a women-only festival called the Thesmophoria. It was held every year in honor of the goddess Demeter, who represented agriculture and fertility, and it was scheduled according to the moon. The festival lasted 3 days and took place during the autumn, around the time of the waning moon. Women would leave their homes, leave their families, and go to a sacred space outside the city where they would camp together, perform rituals, and share a communal experience. During this festival, women had complete autonomy. Men were not allowed, not even to observe from a distance. This was women's time, women's space, and it was governed by the moon. The festival always happened at the same point in the lunar cycle, so women knew year after year when to expect it. They could prepare, they could anticipate. The moon was their invitation. Now, think about what this meant for a woman's sense of time. She had the daily rhythm of the sun. She had the weekly rhythm of the church bells or the market days. She had the monthly rhythm of her own body and the moon. And she had the yearly rhythm of the seasons and the festivals. All of these layers of time stacked on top of each other, creating a rich, textured experience of living. Time was not linear. It was circular, it was spiral, it repeated, but it also evolved. There is a beautiful concept in many indigenous cultures called circular time or cyclical time. The idea is that time is not a straight line moving from past to future. Instead, it is a circle, or better yet, a spiral. You come back to the same point, but you're not exactly in the same place. You have moved upward, or inward, or deeper. You're experiencing the same season, the same moon phase, the same festival, but you are different. You have grown. You have changed. Women understood this intuitively because they lived it every month. Every time the moon completed its cycle, every time their own cycle began again, they were reminded that time is not about racing forward. It is about moving through phases, growing, waning, resting, beginning again. Let me share something personal with you. I do not know if you have ever taken the time to really watch the moon over the course of a month. I mean really watch it. Go outside every night, if the weather allows, and just look. Notice how it changes, day by day, so slowly that you almost cannot see it happening. And yet, over the course of 2 weeks, it transforms completely, from a sliver of light to a full round orb. And then it begins to shrink again, disappearing bit by bit until it is gone altogether, and then, just when you think it is lost, it reappears, a thin crescent, a promise that the cycle continues. There is something deeply comforting about that, especially in a world that often feels chaotic and unpredictable. The moon reminds us that some things are constant, some rhythms endure. No matter what is happening in our lives, the moon will keep turning, the cycles will keep cycling, and we are part of that. We are not separate from it. We are woven into it. Ancient women knew this in their bones. They did not need astronomy textbooks to tell them about lunar phases, or gravitational pulls or orbital periods. They just needed to look up, night after night, month after month, year after year. And in doing so, they developed a relationship with the moon. It became a friend, a teacher, a mirror. In many ancient cultures, the moon was associated with feminine deities: Selene in Greece, Luna in Rome, Artemis, the virgin huntress who roamed by moonlight, Chang'e in China, Mamaquilla in the Inca Empire, Ixchel among the Maya. The list goes on, and these goddesses were not just symbols. They represented something that women experienced as real: the power of cycles, the mystery of transformation, the wisdom that comes from moving through darkness and light again and again. There is a story from ancient Mesopotamia, from around 2000 before the Common Era, about a priestess named Enheduanna. She is actually one of the first named authors in human history. She wrote hymns and poems, and many of them were dedicated to the moon god Nana. But in her writings, she often speaks about the moon in deeply personal terms. She describes watching the moon rise over the city of Ur. She describes how the moonlight comforts her during times of political turmoil and personal exile. The moon for her is not just a celestial body, it is a presence, a companion. And I think that is what the moon was for countless women throughout history: a companion, especially during the long dark nights when the sun was gone and the only light came from the moon and the stars. Imagine being a woman in a time before electricity, before streetlights, before flashlights. When night fell, the world became a very different place. It became mysterious, sometimes frightening, but if the moon was full or even partially full, it provided enough light to see by, enough light to walk outside, enough light to feel safe. Women who needed to fetch water at night, or check on an animal, or tend to a sick child, would wait for the moon. They would say, "I will go when the moon rises," or "I will wait until the moon is high enough to light my path." The moon was not just a calendar, it was a lantern, a guide through the darkness. And here is something that fascinates me. Modern research has found that human sleep patterns do actually change with the lunar cycle. A study published in 2021 analysed sleep data from indigenous communities in Argentina and from college students in the United States, and they found that people tend to go to sleep later and sleep less in the days leading up to a full moon. Researchers believe this is because our ancestors evolved in a world where moonlight provided extra hours of usable time. When the moon was full, they could stay up a bit later, do a bit more work, socialize a bit longer. And even though most of us no longer live by moonlight, our bodies still carry that ancient pattern. Women in the past did not fight this rhythm, they worked with it. During the full moon, they might stay up later, finish that weaving project, talk with neighbours, enjoy the cooler evening air and the beautiful light. And during the new moon, when the nights were pitch black, they would go to bed earlier. There was nothing else to do, no light to see by. So they rested. They slept. They allowed the darkness to be what it was, a time to stop, a time to dream. Can you imagine living that way, letting your schedule adjust naturally based on the light available? It sounds almost impossible in our modern world, where we are expected to maintain the same schedule every single night regardless of whether the moon is full or absent. But there is a freedom in it, is there not? A permission to be flexible, to respond to the natural world rather than impose our will on it. I want to share one more story with you before we move on. There was a tradition in many coastal communities all over the world of women gathering to work together during the full moon. They would bring their sewing, their weaving, their mending, and thus they would sit outside in the moonlight and work together. They called these gatherings by different names depending on the culture: moon circles, lunar gatherings, women's work nights. But the principle was the same. The full moon provided enough light to work by, and the communal aspect made the work less tedious, more joyful. These gatherings were also times for storytelling. Older women would share wisdom with younger women. They would talk about childbirth, about herbal remedies, about how to manage a household, about how to navigate difficult relationships. The moon witnessed these conversations. The moon held space for this intergenerational transfer of knowledge. and in doing so the moon became woven into the fabric of women's culture. So what can we take from this? What does the moon teach us about time and about living? I think it teaches us that time does not have to be rigid, that we can have rhythms that are longer than a day, that we can pay attention to cycles that take weeks to unfold, that we can be patient, that we can trust that what wanes will wax again, that what disappears will return, and maybe, just maybe, we can look up more often. Notice the moon, track its phases, let it remind us that we are part of something ancient and ongoing, that the same moon our ancestors looked up at is the same moon we see tonight. That connection, that thread through time, is real, and it is beautiful. But the moon and the body's rhythms were not the only ways women measured time, because beyond the day, beyond the month, there was another timekeeper, one that demanded attention every single day, multiple times a day, one that was tied to survival itself, one that brought structure, ritual, and an almost meditative rhythm to the chaos of daily life. And that timekeeper was food. So let us head back inside now into the warmth of the kitchen, where the fire is burning and there is work to be done, because the next part of our story is about to unfold. Smell was the first signal. Bread baking, porridge bubbling, herbs releasing their fragrance into steam. Before a woman ever looked at the sun or listened for bells, her nose told her where she was in the day. Because food was not just sustenance. Food was a clock. Every meal was a milestone. Every stage of preparation marked the passage of time in a way that was tangible, immediate, impossible to ignore. Welcome to the kitchen, the true command center of a woman's day. This was where time became something you could taste, something you could touch, something you could measure in the rising of dough and the reduction of a sauce. And for women across centuries and continents, the rhythm of cooking created a structure so reliable, so essential, that entire days revolved around it. Let me introduce you to someone new. Her name is Marjorie, and she lives in a village in England in the year 1450. She is 32 years old, married to a carpenter, they're to 5 children, and every single morning of her life begins the same way, in darkness, in cold, with the need to build a fire from embers that she carefully banked the night before. Picture Marjorie kneeling on the stone floor of her small home. It is still dark outside, so dark that she cannot see her hand in front of her face, but her body knows what time it is. Her body knows that dawn is perhaps an hour away. And if she does not start the fire now, if she does not get the porridge cooking now, her family will wake to a cold house and no breakfast. So she works by touch, by memory, by the knowledge that has been trained into her muscles through years of repetition. She carefully blows on the embers, adds kindling, waits for the first small flame to catch. And as the fire grows, as the light begins to fill the room, she adds larger pieces of wood. The heat spreads, the room transforms, and Marjorie knows, without looking outside, without checking any kind of clock, that it is time. Time to start the day's first meal. Now here is what is fascinating. In medieval England, and in fact in most pre-industrial societies, people ate breakfast very early. Not because they had early morning meetings or needed to catch a train, but because their bodies had been fasting all night, sometimes for 12 or 14 hours, and they needed fuel to begin the day's labour. Breakfast was usually simple: porridge made from oats or barley, bread left over from the day before, perhaps some ale, which was safer to drink than water and provided calories and nutrients. But the preparation of even this simple meal took time, real time. Marjorie has to grind the grain if it is not already ground. She has to measure it, add water, stir it constantly over the fire so it does not burn. This takes perhaps 30 minutes, maybe 45 if the fire is slow to heat. And during this entire process, Marjorie is measuring time, not with a clock, but with her senses. The thickness of the porridge tells her how long it has been cooking. The lightening of the sky outside the window tells her how close they are to full dawn. The stirring of her children upstairs tells her they will be down soon, hungry and impatient. By the time the porridge is ready, the sun is rising. The day has officially begun, and Marjorie has completed the first major time marker of her day. Breakfast done. Now stay with me here because this is where it gets really interesting. Every culture, every time period, had a different rhythm of meals, and that rhythm dictated the entire flow of the day. In ancient Rome, for example, people typically ate 3 meals. A light breakfast called ientaculum, eaten shortly after waking. A midday meal called prandium, which was also fairly light. And then the main meal of the day called cena, which happened in the late afternoon or early evening. That meal could last for hours, especially among the wealthy. It was a social event. A time to gather, a time to talk and share and connect. For Roman women, particularly those managing households, the timing of cena was crucial. They had to plan backwards from that meal. If cena was to be served at the 8th hour, roughly around 3 in the afternoon by our modern reckoning, then preparation had to begin hours earlier. Bread needed to be baked in the morning, vegetables needed to be gathered from the garden. If there was to be meat, it needed to be prepared, seasoned, cooked. Everything timed so that it would all come together at the right moment. And here is the thing, there were no timers, no kitchen clocks, no apps to set reminders. Instead, women used incremental markers. They would say to themselves or to their servants, "Start the bread after the morning market crowd disperses," or "Put the stew on the fire when the sun reaches that spot on the wall," or "The roast needs to cook for the time it takes to spin 1 full distaff of wool." Yes, you heard that right. Time was measured in tasks. How long does it take to spin a certain amount of wool? That is how long the roast needs to cook. How long does it take to walk to the well and back 3 times? That is how long the bread needs to rise. This is embodied time, time measured in action, in movement, in work. There is a medieval cookbook that survives from the 1400s called The Form of Cury. It is one of the earliest cookbooks written in English, compiled by the cooks who work for King Richard II, and if you read through the recipes, you will notice something remarkable. Almost none of them give precise cooking times in minutes or hours. Instead, they give instructions like boil until tender, or cook until the sauce reduces by half, or bake until golden. The cook had to use judgment, experience, intuition. They had to watch, smell, taste, touch. They had to be present with the food. Let me tell you about candle clocks because they are absolutely fascinating. In monasteries and wealthy households where people needed to measure time during the night, they used candles that had been carefully marked with lines or had nails inserted at regular intervals. As the candle burned down, it would reach each mark or nail, and that would indicate a certain amount of time had passed. When a nail was reached, it would fall and make a small noise, acting almost like an alarm. Women in kitchens sometimes used a similar principle. They would light a candle when they started a long cooking dish and know that by the time the candle burned down to a certain point, the dish should be ready. It was not perfectly accurate. Candles burned at different rates depending on the quality of the wax, the temperature of the room, the presence of drafts, but it was good enough. And good enough was often all that was needed. In ancient Egypt, women used water clocks for cooking, especially for dishes that required precise timing. A water clock, or clepsydra, was a vessel with a small hole in the bottom. Water would drip out at a relatively steady rate, and marks on the inside of the vessel showed how much time had passed. Egyptian bakers, many of whom were women, used these to time the baking of certain ceremonial breads that needed to be absolutely perfect for temple offerings. But most women, most of the time, relied on something even more fundamental: the cycle of meals itself. Breakfast marked the beginning of the day. The midday meal marked the halfway point. The evening meal marked the end of the productive day. And between these markers, smaller tasks were slotted in. You did certain chores in the morning between breakfast and the midday meal, other chores in the afternoon between the midday meal and the evening meal. The meals created a scaffolding, a framework, a way to organize the formless hours. Let me give you a specific example from colonial America, because the records from that time period are particularly detailed. A woman named Sarah Kemble Knight kept a diary in the early 1700s. She was a teacher, a businesswoman, and a mother, and in her diary she describes her daily routine. She wakes before dawn, builds the fire, prepares a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush and milk for her family. This is done by first light. Then throughout the morning she works on various tasks, teaching children to read, keeping accounts for her shop, but around what she describes as when the sun is high, she stops to prepare the midday meal. This is the largest meal of the day in colonial America. It typically consists of a stew or a meat pie, bread, vegetables from the garden, and perhaps some preserved fruit. The preparation of this meal takes at least 2 hours, maybe 3, and it serves as the anchor point for the entire day. After the midday meal is eaten and cleaned up, there is a brief period of rest. Then the afternoon tasks begin: more teaching, more business, tending the garden, preserving food, sewing, spinning, and as the sun begins to lower in the sky, Sarah starts thinking about the evening meal. This is usually simpler than the midday meal. Often it is just leftover stew warmed up, bread, perhaps some cheese, something that does not require hours of preparation, because by this point in the day Sarah is exhausted. She writes in her diary, "I know the day is near its end when I find myself reheating the pot from noon. My body tells me it is time to sit, to rest, to let the fire burn low." Do you see? The food is the clock. The rhythm of cooking and eating structures everything else. Now, I want to talk about something that might seem small but is actually profound: the act of stirring. Think about how many dishes require constant or frequent stirring. Porridge, soup, stew, sauce, custard. In the days before modern stoves with precise temperature controls, stirring was essential. It prevented burning, it ensured even cooking. It kept the texture smooth. But stirring also demanded presence. You could not wander away and forget about the pot. You had to stay close, you had to pay attention. And in doing so, you became intimately aware of time passing. 5 minutes of stirring feels very different from 20 minutes of stirring. Your arm gets tired, your back starts to ache, your mind wanders and then returns. The stirring itself becomes a form of meditation, a way of being present in the moment, a way of measuring time with your body. There is a beautiful description from a Japanese text dating back to the Heian period, around the year 1000 of the Common Era, that describes a court lady preparing rice porridge for a sick friend. The text says, "She stirred the pot with such gentle patience, never rushing, letting the rice soften in its own time. She knew that good food, like a good life, cannot be hurried. It must be given the time it needs." I love that, the idea that cooking teaches patience, that it teaches us to work with natural processes rather than against them. Bread dough cannot be rushed. It needs time to rise. Meat cannot be rushed. It needs time to become tender. Flavors cannot be rushed. They need time to develop, to meld, to deepen. And women who spent hours every day cooking learned this lesson in their bones. They learned to work with time, not against it. They learned to trust the process. They learned to recognize the signs that told them when something was ready. The smell, the color, the texture, the sound it made when stirred. These were their clocks. Here is something that blows my mind every time I think about it. A woman in medieval Europe might spend 6 to 8 hours a day just on food-related tasks, grinding grain, baking bread, tending the fire, cooking meals, cleaning up, preserving food for winter. That is a full-time job. Actually, it is more than a full-time job, and every single one of those hours was measured not by a clock on the wall, but by the work itself. How long does it take to bake bread? From mixing the dough to pulling the finished loaves from the oven, it might take 5 or 6 hours, but a woman would not think, this will take 6 hours. She would think, I need to start this after breakfast if we want fresh bread for the evening meal. The endpoint dictated when to begin. The rhythm of meals dictated the rhythm of work. And you know what is fascinating? This way of thinking about time is actually more flexible, more adaptive than our modern clock-based thinking. Because if something went wrong, if the fire was slow to heat or the dough was slow to rise, the woman did not panic and say, "Oh no, I am behind schedule." She simply adjusted. She pushed the evening meal back a bit. She asked her family to be patient. She worked with what was, not with what she had planned for it to be. There is wisdom in that. Real wisdom. How often do we get stressed and frustrated because things are not happening according to our precise timeline? How often do we feel like failures because we did not finish a task in the exact amount of time we allotted for it? But what if we took a page from these historical women and said, it will be ready when it is ready, and that is okay? Let me share one more thing before we move on to the next part of our journey. In many cultures, there was a ritual element to cooking. Food preparation was not just a chore, it was a sacred act. In ancient Greece, women would say a prayer to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, before lighting the cooking fire each morning. In Hindu households, the kitchen was considered a sacred space, and women would perform purification rituals before entering it to cook. This sacredness elevated the work. It made the repetitive tasks of daily cooking into something meaningful, something important, and it also created another layer of time marking. The morning prayer to Hestia signalled the start of the day's work. The evening offering of the first portion of the meal to the gods signalled the completion of the day's labour. Religion and food and time all woven together into a seamless whole. So, what can we learn from this? What does the kitchen clock teach us? I think it teaches us that time does not have to be abstract, that it can be embodied, sensory, immediate, that we can measure our days not just in hours and minutes, but in the tasks we complete, the meals we prepare, the rituals we honour, that there is a certain kind of peace that comes from working at the pace the work demands rather than the pace a clock demands. And maybe, just maybe, we can bring a little bit of that into our modern kitchens. What if instead of checking the clock constantly, we trusted our senses? What if we stirred until it felt right, not until the timer beeped? What if we let the food tell us when it is ready? It is a small shift, but it is a shift back toward the wisdom that women carried for thousands of years. But food and meals were just one part of a larger rhythm, because while the daily cycle of cooking gave structure to each individual day, there was a much bigger pattern at play, one that stretched across weeks and months, one that demanded different foods, different tasks, different rhythms depending on what the earth itself was doing. And that is where we're going next, because the next timekeeper was not measured in hours or days, it was measured in seasons, and the seasons, my friends, were the grandest clock of all. The air changed. That was how she knew, not a dramatic shift, nothing you could point to and say, there, that is the moment winter became spring, but something subtle, a softening in the wind, a different quality to the light, the smell of earth thawing, and a woman standing in her doorway with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, would breathe in deeply and know, the season is turning, time to prepare. If the sun was a woman's daily clock and the moon her monthly calendar, then the seasons were her great year wheel, the massive turning of time that governed everything. What she planted, what she harvested, what she wore, what she ate, how she worked, even how she rested. The seasons were not just weather patterns. They were chapters in the book of her life, each one demanding different rhythms, different tasks, different wisdom. Let me take you through a year. Not a modern year with numbered months and fixed dates, but a woman's year. A year lived close to the earth, close to the rhythms that humans followed for thousands of generations before calendars told us January 1st was the start of anything. We begin in spring, not on a specific date, but when spring actually arrives, when the frost stops biting quite so hard, when the first green shoots push up through the cold soil, when birds return from wherever they spent the winter. A woman in medieval France, let us call her Isabel, knows spring has truly arrived not because a calendar tells her it is March 20th, but because she can feel it. The light lasts longer, the chickens start laying more eggs, the cow's milk becomes richer, creamier, because fresh grass is finally growing again. Spring is rebirth. And for women, spring meant one thing above all else: preparation. The fields needed to be ploughed and planted. Seeds saved from last year's harvest needed to be sorted, inspected, chosen carefully. The good ones for planting, the lesser ones for eating now, before supplies ran even lower. Because late winter and early spring, this was the hungry time. The stores from last harvest were running low. The new crops were not ready yet. Every household was stretching what they had, making it last just a little bit longer. Isabel's tasks in spring were specific and urgent. She worked alongside her husband and children to prepare the garden plots. The vegetable garden was her domain, her responsibility. While her husband focused on the larger fields of grain, Isabel managed the garden that would feed her family through the coming year. She planted onions, leeks, peas, beans, herbs. Each plant had its right time. Peas could handle the cold, so they went in early. Beans needed warmer soil, so they waited. Isabel did not need a planting guide or a farmer's almanac, though some wealthy households had them. She knew from experience, from watching her mother, from years of trial and error, exactly when each seed should go into the ground. And here is something beautiful. In many medieval communities, there were traditional dates for planting tied to the church calendar. People would say, plant your peas by the Feast of the Annunciation, which falls on March 25th, or put in your beans after the Feast of St. George, which is April 23rd. These feast days served as collective memory, a way to pass down agricultural knowledge across generations. The church calendar, which women already followed for spiritual reasons, doubled as a farming schedule. But beyond the garden, spring brought other critical tasks for women. This was when new animals were born. Lambs, calves, chicks, and caring for these babies was often women's work. Isabel would spend hours making sure the newborn lamb was nursing properly, that the chicks were warm enough, that the calf was thriving. Because these animals represented survival. The lamb would grow and provide wool for spinning. The calf would become a milk cow. The chicks would lay eggs. Losing an animal in spring was a serious blow to a household's future. Spring was also when women did the deep cleaning that we still even today call spring cleaning. After months of being closed up in smoky dark houses, women would throw open the shutters, air out the bedding, scrub the floors, wash the walls. This was not just about cleanliness. It was about renewal, about preparing the home for the brighter, warmer months ahead. And it was hard physical work, exhausting work, but necessary work. Now, let the wheel turn. Summer arrives. The days are long now, gloriously long. The sun rises early and sets late, and every bit of that light is precious. Because summer is when the real work happens. The garden is producing. Vegetables are ripening faster than they can be eaten. And this is where a woman's skill at preservation becomes absolutely critical. Meet someone new. Her name is Eliza, and she lives in colonial Virginia in the year 1720. It is high summer. The heat is oppressive, thick and humid, but Eliza cannot rest, because everything in her garden is ready at once. The cucumbers, the beans, the peas, the herbs. If she does not preserve them now, they will rot. All that work, all those months of tending will be wasted. So Eliza spends her summer days in a hot kitchen, made even hotter by the fire that must be kept burning for the preservation work. She makes pickles, submerging cucumbers in brine and vinegar. She dries beans, spreading them on cloths in the sun. She makes herb bundles, hanging them from the rafters to dry. She boils fruit with precious sugar to make preserves and jams that will sweeten the dark days of winter. She salts meat, she smokes fish, she churns butter and packs it in crocks. This work is relentless. There is no weekend, no vacation. The garden does not stop producing just because Eliza is tired. And so she works, dawn to dusk, and often beyond dusk by candlelight, because there is always more to do. Summer is abundance, yes, but it is also labour. Intense, focused, essential labour. And here is what is remarkable. Eliza does not need anyone to tell her that she must do this work. She knows, because she has lived through winters. She knows what it feels like to run out of preserved vegetables in February and have nothing fresh to eat until April. She knows what it is like to ration the last jar of jam, making it last as long as possible. The memory of past winters drives the work of present summers. The season itself is the reminder. The calendar is written in the ripeness of the tomatoes, the abundance of the beans, the heat of the sun. Summer also brought specific communal events. Haymaking, for instance. This was when the grass was cut and dried to make hay for feeding animals through the winter. It was a job that required many hands, and entire communities would come together. Women and men both worked in the fields during haymaking, and for women, this meant their regular household tasks had to be compressed or postponed. They would wake even earlier, prepare simple meals that could be eaten quickly in the field, and work until they could barely stand. There is a medieval English poem that describes haymaking, and it mentions women working alongside men, raking the cut grass, turning it so it would dry evenly, gathering it into bundles. The poem says, "In the heat of summer all hands are needed, and no one rests while the sun shines, for the hay must be gathered before the rain comes." Then the wheel turns again. Autumn, harvest time, and if you think summer was intense, autumn is something else entirely. This is when the grain is ready. The wheat, the barley, the rye, the oats. These are the crops that will literally keep the family alive through winter. Bread is the foundation of the diet, and bread comes from grain, and grain must be harvested in a very narrow window of time. Too early and the grain is not fully ripe. Too late and it might be ruined by rain or wind or early frost. So when the grain is ready, everything else stops. Every able-bodied person goes to the fields, women included. They work from first light until it is too dark to see, cutting the grain with sickles, binding it into sheaves, carrying it to the barn. It is back-breaking work, painful work, the kind of work that makes your muscles scream and your hands bleed, but it gets done because it must. There is no choice. This is survival. And after the grain is harvested and safely stored, there is a moment, a pause, a breath. Many communities held harvest festivals, celebrations of Thanksgiving for the food that would sustain them through the coming winter. Women would bake special breads, prepare feasts, gather with neighbours to celebrate the completion of the hardest work of the year. In England, there was a tradition called Harvest Home, where the last sheaf of grain was brought in with great ceremony, often decorated with ribbons and flowers. Women would prepare a massive feast, and the entire community would eat together, drink together, sing together. It was a moment of collective relief. We did it. We made it. We have food for winter. But even as they celebrated, women were already thinking ahead. Because autumn was also when the serious work of winter preparation began. Animals that would not be kept through winter needed to be slaughtered. The meat needed to be preserved, salted, smoked, packed in barrels. This was heavy, messy, difficult work, but absolutely essential. Autumn was also when women made cheese in larger quantities, when they pressed cider from apples, when they gathered nuts from the forest, when they did final checks on all their preserved goods to make sure everything was properly stored and would not spoil. And then, finally, winter. The wheel turns one last time and the world grows cold and dark. The days shorten dramatically. Work that can only be done outdoors becomes impossible. The fields are frozen, the garden is dead, the animals are sheltered, and life moves indoors. For women, winter was not a time of rest exactly, but it was a different kind of work, indoor work, quieter work. This was when the spinning and weaving happened in earnest. All that wool that had been sheared from sheep in spring and summer, it had been waiting for winter. Because spinning and weaving are tasks that require hours and hours of sitting in one place, and in summer, there simply was not time for that. But in winter, when darkness fell early and there was little else to be done, women would sit by the fire and spin. They would spin by feel, by muscle memory, while they talked or told stories or sang. Their hands knew the work swell that their minds could wander. And over the course of the long winter months, they would produce enough thread to weave cloth for the coming year. Cloth for clothing, cloth for blankets, cloth for everything. Winter was also when women did mending. All the clothes that had been torn or worn thin during the busy seasons, now there was time to repair them, to patch them, to make them last another year, because fabric was precious. Every scrap had value. Nothing was wasted. And winter was when women taught. Older women teaching younger women the skills they would need. How to spin evenly. How to judge the quality of wool. How to recognize when cloth was woven tightly enough. How to cook. How to preserve. How to manage a household. Winter was the season of knowledge transfer. But here is what I find most profound about this seasonal rhythm. It was not imposed from outside. It was inherent. It came from the earth itself. A woman in medieval England and a woman in ancient China and a woman in indigenous North America, they all lived by this same basic pattern. Plant in spring, tend in summer, harvest in autumn, preserve and prepare in winter. The specific crops might be different. The specific techniques might vary. But the fundamental rhythm was universal, because it is the rhythm of life on Earth. It is the rhythm our species evolved with. For 99% of human history, this is how people lived. Following the seasons, working with them, resting when the Earth rested, labouring when the Earth demanded labour, and women were the keepers of this rhythm. They were the ones who remembered when to plant and when to preserve. They were the ones who passed the knowledge down, generation after generation, mother to daughter, grandmother to granddaughter, an unbroken chain of seasonal wisdom stretching back thousands of years. What have we lost by breaking that chain? By living in climate-controlled homes where every season feels roughly the same? By eating strawberries in December and butternut squash in June? by having the same work schedule 52 weeks a year, regardless of whether the days are long or short, hot or cold. I am not saying we should go back to the subsistence farming, but I am saying we have lost something. We have lost the understanding that our energy naturally ebbs and flows with the seasons, that it is okay, even good, to work intensely during certain months and rest more during others, that our bodies, our minds, our very souls are designed to move through cycles, not to maintain the same pace year-round. Some of you listening might already know this. You might have noticed that you feel more energized in summer, more introspective in winter. That is not laziness. That is not seasonal depression necessarily. That is your body remembering an ancient rhythm, responding to light, to temperature, to the fundamental patterns that still exist even if we try to ignore them. So here is my question. What would it look like to honor the seasons in your own life? Not in a farming way necessarily, but in some way. Maybe it means doing different kinds of work in different seasons. Creative work in spring when everything feels fresh and new. Intense productive work in summer when your energy is high. Finishing and sharing your work in autumn. Reflecting and learning in winter. What would that feel like? Would it feel more natural, more sustainable? The seasonal rhythm taught women patience on a grand scale. It taught them to trust that even when nothing seems to be happening, growth is occurring underground, invisible but real. It taught them that every season has its purpose, its gifts, its challenges, and its end, because the wheel always turns. Winter always gives way to spring, darkness always gives way to light. But seasons were vast, sweeping timekeepers. What about the smaller, more intimate rhythms? What about the work that happened every single day? Work so constant, so central to women's lives that it became almost like breathing. Work that measured time in the movement of hands, the rhythm of fibers becoming thread, thread becoming cloth, cloth becoming the very fabric that held families together. That is where we turn next. To the spinning wheel, to the loom, to the ancient meditative art that gave women not just clothing, but time itself. Listen, can you hear it? A soft whirring, the gentle hum of a wheel turning, the rhythmic pull and twist of fibers becoming thread. For thousands of years, this sound was the soundtrack of women's lives. Not occasional, not once in a while, but constant, daily, a sound so familiar that it became almost like a heartbeat. The spinning wheel did not just produce thread, it produced time itself, measurable, predictable, deeply personal time. Sit with me for a moment in ancient Athens, in the year 430 before the Common Era, in a modest home on a side street, away from the grand marble temples and bustling agora, a woman sits on a low stool. Her name is Calliope. She is perhaps 40 years old. Her fingers move with a grace that comes from decades of practice. In her left hand she holds a distaff, a simple stick wound with cleaned carded wool. In her right hand she manipulates a drop spindle, a weighted tool that hangs and spins in the air, twisting the fibers into thread as it falls. Watch her hands, they never stop moving. Pull fibers from the distaff, attach them to the spindle, give it a spin, let it drop. The weight and momentum twist the fibers. When the spindle reaches the ground, she winds the newly spun thread around it and begins again. Pull, spin, drop, wind, pull, spin, drop, wind, over and over and over for hours. How long does it take Calliope to spin enough thread to weave a simple tunic for her son? Researchers who study ancient textile production have done the math, and the numbers are staggering. For every hour spent weaving, a woman needed to spend approximately 10 hours spinning thread. 10 to 1, let that sink in for a moment. If you wanted to weave for just 1 hour, you first had to spin for 10. A recent experimental archaeology project tried to recreate an ancient Greek garment, a basic chlamys, which is like a short cloak. A team of 3 experienced spinners and weavers worked together. They calculated that from sheep to finished garment, including shearing the wool, cleaning it, carding it, spinning the thread, setting up the loom, weaving the fabric and finishing the edges, the process took between 319 to 379 hours of labour. For one garment. Think about your closet right now. How many pieces of clothing do you own? 20, 50, 100? Now imagine that every single item required hundreds of hours of hand labour to produce. Suddenly that worn-out shirt you are about to throw away looks different, does it not? For Calliope and women like her across the ancient world, spinning was not a hobby. It was not something you did when you felt like it. It was essential work. Your family needed clothing, they needed blankets, they needed cloth for a dozen different uses, and the only way to get that cloth was to make it yourself, which meant spinning, endless spinning. But here is where it gets interesting from a time management perspective. Because spinning, unlike many other tasks, was incredibly portable and flexible, Calliope could spin while sitting outside watching her children play. She could spin while chatting with neighbours. She could spin while walking from one place to another. Ancient art depicts women spinning in all kinds of situations, at home, at the well, at the market. Even goddesses were depicted spinning. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and crafts, is often shown with a spindle. So is Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Spinning was so universal, so constant, that even divine beings did it, and this portability meant that spinning filled the gaps. The in-between moments. You're waiting for water to boil. Spin. You're sitting with a sick child who needs you nearby but is sleeping. Spin. You have 10 minutes before you need to start preparing the evening meal. Spin. The work was always there, always available, always moving forward incrementally. This created a very particular relationship with time. Because you could not spin a tunic's worth of thread in one sitting, it was impossible. But you could spin a little bit every day, and those little bits added up. Over weeks, over months, until one day you had enough thread. And then you could weave, and then you had cloth, and then you had a garment. It taught patience on a profound level. It taught the value of incremental progress. It taught that massive achievements are built from tiny repeated actions. These are lessons we desperately need today in a world of instant gratification and overnight success stories. Let me introduce you to someone from a different time and place. Her name is Goodwife Martha, and she lives in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the year 1650. The tools are different now. Instead of a drop spindle, Martha has a spinning wheel. This technology came to Europe in the Middle Ages and revolutionized thread production. It was faster, more efficient, but it was still slow by modern standards, and it still required hours upon hours of work. Martha's spinning wheel sits in the corner of her one-room house. It is one of her most valuable possessions. In her will, which has been preserved in historical archives, she specifically mentions the spinning wheel, bequeathing it to her eldest daughter. Because a good spinning wheel was an investment, a tool that could last generations if cared for properly. Every winter evening after the supper dishes are cleaned and the children are put to bed, Martha sits at her wheel. The room is lit only by the fire and perhaps one precious candle. Her foot works the treadle turning the wheel. Her hands guide the fibre. The sound fills the small house, a creaking, whirring lullaby. Her husband sits nearby, perhaps mending a tool or carving something. They do not speak much. They are both tired from a long day of hard work. But there is a companionship in the shared quiet, in the rhythm of their separate tasks happening side by side. Martha spins for about 2 hours each evening. sometimes 3 if she is trying to finish enough thread for a specific project. Over the course of a winter, she will produce enough thread to weave cloth for new shirts for her sons, a new dress for herself, linens for the table, perhaps a warm blanket. But she must plan carefully. She must calculate how much wool she has, how much thread she needs, how much time it will take. Spinning becomes a way of measuring her winter. She might think, I have enough wool for 30 evenings of spinning, and thus she knows how long her project will take. The spinning wheel is her clock. There is something meditative about repetitive handwork. Modern research on activities like knitting has found that the rhythmic, repetitive motions can induce a state similar to meditation. Heart rate slows, stress hormones decrease, the mind enters a calm, focused state. Women who spun for hours every day were, in a sense, practicing daily meditation. They might not have called it that, but they knew that there was something soothing about the work, something that quieted the mind even as the hand stayed busy. In ancient Greek literature, there are references to women using spinning time for storytelling. They would gather together, multiple women in one home, and spin while one woman told a story or sang a song. This served multiple purposes. The work got done, but it also created community. It passed down cultural knowledge, it made the hours pass more pleasantly, and it synchronized their work. When women worked together, they often fell into the same rhythm, their wheels or spindles moving in time with each other, creating a kind of music, a textile symphony. There is a famous story, more legend than history but revealing nonetheless, about spinning bees in colonial America. A spinning bee was like a quilting bee, except instead of quilting, women would gather to spin together. They would bring their wheels to one home and spend the entire day spinning. It was partly productive, a way to accomplish a lot of work quickly, but it was also social. It was fun. Young women might meet young men who stopped by in the evening after the spinning was done. Marriages were sometimes arranged at spinning bees. Time measured not just in thread produced, but in relationships built, in community strengthened. Let me tell you about a discovery that archaeologists made. In ancient sites all over Europe, they find these small pyramid-shaped objects made of fired clay. For years, scholars were not quite sure what they were. They found them by the hundreds, sometimes thousands, at a single site. Eventually, they realized these were loom weights. When you weave on a vertical warp-weighted loom, which was the most common type in ancient Greece and Rome, you need weights to keep the vertical threads, the warp, taut. These clay weights did that job. But here is what is remarkable. For decades, archaeologists would find these loom weights and just toss them aside. They were looking for gold, for jewelry, for impressive artifacts. Clay loom weights were considered junk, not worth studying, not worth keeping. It was only in recent decades, as more women entered the field of archaeology and as scholars began taking women's history seriously, that people realized these loom weights were incredibly valuable. They told us about daily life, about the work women did, about the tools they used, about the scale of textile production. Each loom weight represented hours of women's labor, and the fact that they found thousands of them at some sites tells us that textile production was not a small-scale, occasional activity. It was industrial, it was constant, it was the economic foundation of these societies, and every single thread used in that production had to be spun by hand, by women's hands, for hours and hours and hours. Now, let me connect this back to time management, because I think there is something we have lost in our modern world that these ancient women understood instinctively. They understood that not all time is the same, that there is productive time and there is process time. Productive time is when you are making visible progress. You are weaving and the cloth is growing before your eyes. Process time is when you are preparing. You are spinning thread that will eventually be woven. You're not seeing the final product yet, but you're doing essential work. Modern culture values productive time almost exclusively. We want to see results. We want to check things off our list. We want visible progress. But process time feels wasteful. It feels like we're not getting anywhere. And so we skip it. We rush through it. We try to eliminate it. But you cannot skip the spinning. You cannot weave without thread. And you cannot make thread without spending those long, slow, patient hours at the wheel. The process time is not optional. It is foundational. What if we applied this wisdom to our own lives? What if we honored the process time, the preparation, the slow accumulation of skills and knowledge and resources that eventually allows us to create something beautiful? What if we stopped feeling guilty about the hours we spend learning, practicing, preparing, and instead recognized them as essential, as the spinning that must happen before the weaving can begin? There is a phrase from the medieval period that I love: she is a good housewife. In the original context, this was high praise. It meant a woman who could spin well, weave well, manage her household efficiently. But the word housewife literally meant house weaver, the woman who wove the fabric that held the household together, both literally, in terms of providing cloth, and figuratively in terms of creating the structure and rhythm of family life. And here is something that breaks my heart a little. For thousands of years, from the earliest civilizations up until the Industrial Revolution, textile production was women's work. It was valuable work. It was skilled work. It was economically important work. But it was rarely recorded, rarely celebrated, rarely considered worthy of historical attention. We have detailed records of kings and battles and political treaties, but the work that clothed those kings, that provided the tents for those battles, that warmed the diplomats negotiating those treaties, that work was invisible. It is only now, with modern scholarship, that we are beginning to understand the true scope and importance of women's textile work. We are beginning to calculate the hours, to measure the economic value, to recognize the skill, and in doing so we are recovering a piece of human history that was almost lost. So when you put on a shirt this morning or wrap yourself in a blanket tonight, take just a moment to think about the fact that for most of human history, every single thread in that fabric was spun by a woman's hands. Hundreds of hours of labor went into creating it, and that woman measured her days, her weeks, her seasons, her life by the rhythm of her spinning. The wheel turned, the thread grew, time passed, and in that passing something useful, something beautiful, something essential was created. But even as women's hands stayed busy with wool and flax, even as the wheels turned and the threads accumulated, there was another measure of time happening, one that was invisible, especially at night, one that created confusion and uncertainty in a way that we, with our glowing clock faces and smartphone screens, can barely imagine. Because when the sun set and darkness fell, time became slippery, unknowable, and women found themselves navigating through hours they could not measure, in a darkness we no longer experience. That is where we venture next, into the night, into the mystery, into a time before time could be seen. Darkness swallowed everything. Not the kind of darkness we know today, where streetlights glow outside our windows and digital clocks cast their blue light across our bedrooms. Real darkness, complete darkness, the kind that makes you hold your hand in front of your face and see absolutely nothing. And in that darkness, time disappeared, simply vanished. A woman could wake in the middle of the night and have absolutely no idea whether she'd been asleep for 1 hour or 6, whether dawn was minutes away or still hours distant. Time which had been so carefully tracked during the day, became a mystery the moment the sun went down. This is perhaps the strangest part of our journey through women's timekeeping. Because we have talked about all these ways women measured and organised their days, the sun, the bells, their bodies, the moon, the meals, the seasons, the spinning, but all of those systems had one enormous blind spot. Nighttime was dead time, unmeasured time, lost time. Let me paint you a picture. It is the year 1380, winter, a small village in England. A woman named Joan lies in her bed, which is really just a straw mattress on a wooden frame. Her husband sleeps beside her. Their 3 children sleep in the same room, huddled together for warmth. The fire has died down to embers. The house is cold, so cold that Joan can see her breath, even though she is under every blanket the family owns. And then she wakes. Her eyes open, but she sees nothing. The darkness is total, absolute. She lies there for a moment, disoriented. Did something wake her? A sound? A dream? She listens. Silence. No roosters crowing. No church bells. No light creeping through the shutters. Just darkness and swans and cold. And here is the question that plagues her. What time is it? Has she been asleep for a few hours? Is it the middle of the night, and she should just roll over and go back to sleep? Or has she been asleep for most of the night? Is dawn approaching? Should she get up and start the fire? She has no way to know. None. The darkness tells her nothing. Her body tells her nothing. She is exhausted, but she is always exhausted. That does not help. So she lies there, uncomfortable now, her mind racing. If she gets up and starts the fire and it turns out to be the middle of the night, she will have wasted precious fuel and lost precious sleep. But if she stays in bed and it is actually almost dawn, she'll be starting her day late, behind in all her tasks. It is a gamble, a guess, and she has to make it in complete ignorance. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine not knowing whether it is midnight or 5 in the morning? It sounds almost comical, but it was reality for the vast majority of women throughout most of human history. Nighttime was a black hole in time. You went to sleep, and then at some point you woke up, and everything in between was unmeasured, unknowable. There is a wonderful, frustrating line from a medieval writer that captures this perfectly. He says, and I am translating from Middle English here, in the 14th century, whilst the hours of daylight could be divided with some accuracy, no one really had any idea what time it was after dark. If you woke up in the winter, you had no way of telling whether it was 3 hours after you had gone to bed or 9. Think about what this meant practically. If you were a woman who needed to wake at a specific time, say because you had promised to help a neighbour with something early in the morning, you just had to hope. Hope that your body would wake you at roughly the right time. And sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. There was no backup plan. No alarm clock, no way to guarantee you would wake when you needed to. Now there were some tools for measuring nighttime hours, but they were rare, they were expensive, and they were not particularly reliable. Let me tell you about them because they are fascinating. First, water clocks. The ancient Greeks and Romans used these. A clepsydra, they called it. Essentially, it was a vessel with a small hole in the bottom. You filled it with water, and the water would drip out at a relatively steady rate. Marks on the inside of the vessel showed how much time had passed based on how much water remained. Some elaborate water clocks had mechanisms that would ring a bell or gong when the water reached a certain level. Monasteries sometimes used water clocks to wake the monks for nighttime prayers. There are records from Benedictine monasteries in the 9th and 10th centuries describing how a monk would be assigned the duty of watching the water clock and ringing the bell to wake the community for matins, the prayer service that happened in the deep middle of the night. But here is the problem. Water clocks were finicky. The rate of drip changed depending on the temperature. In winter, the water might freeze. In summer, evaporation was an issue. The hole could get clogged, the mechanism could break, and even when they worked perfectly, they had to be refilled and reset constantly. They were a lot of work for imperfect results. And remember, we are talking about monasteries here. Wealthy institutions with resources and educated people who understood mathematics and mechanics. The average household had no access to water clocks. They were not something a common woman could own or use. Then there were candle clocks. These were a bit more accessible. The idea was simple. You made a candle and marked it with lines at regular intervals. As the candle burned down, it would reach each mark and you could tell roughly how much time had passed. Some clever versions had small nails inserted at the marks. When the wax burned down to the nail would fall out and make a small clinking sound, a primitive alarm. But candles were expensive, wax was valuable. Most ordinary families used tallow candles, made from animal fat, and those burned irregularly. They sputtered, they smoked, they did not burn at a predictable rate. Only expensive beeswax candles burned smoothly enough to be reliable timekeepers. And who was going to waste expensive beeswax just to know what hour of the night it was? There is a record from a medieval English household account book that lists the price of candles. One good beeswax candle cost about the same as a day's wages for a labourer. So using a candle as a clock was a luxury most people could not afford. The truth is, for most women, most of the time, night was simply a void. Time stopped, or at least the measurement of time stopped, and they adapted to this. They had to. One adaptation was what historians call segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep. Instead of sleeping in one long stretch through the night, people would sleep in two distinct periods, first sleep and second sleep. They would go to bed shortly after dark, sleep for 3 or 4 hours, then wake for an hour or two in the middle of the night, then sleep again until dawn. And here is the fascinating part. During that wakeful period in the middle of the night, people would do things. They would pray, they would talk quietly with their spouse, they would tend the fire, they would think. There are references in historical documents to this watching time as a period of unusual creativity and reflection. Some scholars believe that without the constant stimulation of modern life, the human brain naturally wakes during the night and processes the day's experiences. Women would sometimes use this wakeful period to check on children, to nurse a baby, to lie there in the dark and plan the next day's work. It was not insomnia, it was not a sleep disorder. It was just how people slept before artificial light changed everything. But still, during these wakeful hours, they had no idea what time it was. They might guess based on how rested they felt. If they woke feeling very tired, it was probably early in the night. If they woke feeling more refreshed, maybe they had gotten through most of first sleep. But it was just a guess. There is something both terrifying and beautiful about this, is there not? This nightly surrender to unknowing. Every single night for your entire life you enter a space where you have no control, no knowledge, no ability to measure or track or plan. You just have to trust. Trust that morning will come, trust that you will wake when you need to, trust that the darkness is temporary. Modern sleep researchers have found that our anxiety about time actually disrupts our sleep. How many of us have lain awake at night, watching the clock, calculating how many hours of sleep we will get if we fall asleep right now? And that calculation, that awareness of time passing keeps us awake. We are literally kept awake by our knowledge of time. Medieval women did not have that problem. They could not check the clock, they could not calculate, they just had to surrender. And maybe, paradoxically, that made it easier to sleep. The darkness took away choice, took away control, and sometimes the absence of control brings peace. But I do not want to romanticize this too much, because the inability to measure nighttime also could cause real problems, especially for women who are sick or who are caring for someone sick. Imagine you are a mother with a feverish child. The child needs medicine every few hours, but how do you know when a few hours have passed? You do not. You guess. You do your best, but you have no certainty. Or imagine you are a woman in labour. Labour can last hours, many hours. And in the darkness of night, with no way to measure how long you've been labouring, time becomes elastic, distorted. Minutes feel like hours. Hours disappear in moments of intense pain. Midwives developed an intuitive sense of labour's progression, based on the woman's symptoms and the stages they could observe. But they could not say, you have been in labour for 6 hours. They might say, you went into labour before sunset, and now I hear roosters, so dawn is near. So you have been labouring through the night. Approximate, never precise. There are childbirth accounts from the medieval and early modern period where women describe labour lasting all through the night and into the next day, but they could not be more specific than that. The night was one undifferentiated block of time, and here is something that I find particularly interesting. This inability to measure nighttime meant that nighttime activities were given a different value than daytime activities. Work done during the day could be measured. You could say, I spent the morning spinning, or I worked in the garden from prime to sext. But work done at night? It was uncountable, unmeasurable, and therefore in some economic systems it was considered less valuable or not valuable at all. Women who sat up through the night nursing a sick family member, that work left no trace, no record, no acknowledgement, because it happened in the unmeasured time, the dark time, the time that did not count. This is one of the ways that women's work has been historically undervalued. So much of what women did happened in these unmeasured spaces, the nighttime care work, the invisible emotional labour, the constant low-level monitoring and adjusting that kept households running. None of it could be quantified. None of it fit neatly into the church's canonical hours or later into the merchant's clock time. And so it was dismissed as not real work. But of course it was real. It was essential. It was exhausting. It just could not be measured. And our systems of value have always struggled with things that cannot be measured. Let me tell you one more story. In some northern European cultures, particularly in Scandinavia, winter nights were so long and so dark that communities developed elaborate social systems to cope. They would gather in one house and spend the long dark evenings together. The women would bring their spinning or sewing. The men would bring tools to mend. Children would play together. Someone would tell stories. They called these gatherings by various names. Work nights, sitting evenings. They served multiple purposes. They conserved resources because only one fire needed to be lit instead of many. They provided safety because everyone was together. They made the long darkness less lonely. And interestingly, these gatherings created their own sense of time. Not clock time, but story time. The evening might be measured in tales told. We were there for 3 stories. The children fell asleep halfway through the second tale. Story became a unit of time, and maybe that is more human, more meaningful than hours and minutes anyway. So what do we take from this? What does the mystery of nighttime teach us? I think it teaches us humility. It reminds us that for most of human history, there were vast stretches of time that we simply could not control or measure or organize. And people survived anyway. They adapted. They found different ways of being in relationship with time. It also teaches us about the value of rest, of darkness, of letting go. We live in a world now where nighttime has been conquered. We have lights, we have screens, we have 24-hour schedules. We act as if night and day are the same, as if we should be equally productive at all hours. But our bodies know better. Our bodies remember that night is different. That night is for rest, for dreams, for letting time be unmeasured. Maybe we would sleep better if we could recapture just a little bit of that surrender. If we could let the night be dark, let time be unknown, let ourselves simply drift until morning comes. But night and day, measured or unmeasured, were not the only rhythms that structured women's lives. Because beyond the daily and seasonal cycles, beyond the private experience of time passing, there was another layer, a communal layer, a social layer, because women did not live in isolation. They lived in communities, and those communities had their own shared beats, their own collective markers that everyone moved through together. Markets, festivals, gatherings, the social calendar that said, "We are all in this together, moving through time as one." That is where our story goes next, to the village square, to the festival grounds, to the places where individual time became community time. The noise hit her first, voices calling out, chickens squawking, the clang of metal pots, laughter, arguing, the shuffle of feet on packed dirt, and then the smells, fresh bread, livestock, herbs, sweat, leather, wood smoke, and finally the sight. Colour and movement everywhere, stalls crowded with goods, people pressed together, children darting between adults. This was market day. And for a woman living in isolation on a small farm, working alone day after day, market day was not just about buying and selling. It was about time itself. It was a marker, a milestone, a way to measure the week. If her personal rhythms gave her structure within each day, the community calendar gave her structure across days and weeks and months, and nothing structured that calendar more powerfully than the regular gatherings where people came together. Markets, fairs, festivals, holy days. These were not just social events, they were temporal anchors. They were the points around which women organised their work, their planning, their very sense of where they were in the flow of time. Meet Eleanor. She lives in a village in France in the year 1400. Her farm is about 3 miles from the nearest town. It is not a terrible distance, but it is far enough that she does not go to town every day. She cannot. There is too much work at home, animals to tend, a garden to manage, endless household tasks. So she goes to town once a week, on market day, always the same day, Saturday. And that single weekly trip becomes the axis around which her entire week revolves. On Sunday, the day after market, Eleanor unpacks everything she bought, sorts it, stores it, uses up the fresh food first before it spoils. On Monday and Tuesday, she is still riding the energy of having seen people, having heard news, having been part of something larger than her own small world. But by Wednesday, the week starts to feel long. Thursday is the middle, the slog. Friday is better because she can start thinking about market day again. What will she bring to sell? What does she need to buy? Who will she see? Saturday morning she wakes with a different energy. Market day. She gathers her eggs, her cheese, whatever surplus her household has produced. She dresses in her better clothing, the one without too many patches. She walks the 3 miles to town, and for a few hours she is part of the flow, part of the community, part of something rhythmic and shared. This is not just routine. This is time made social, time made meaningful through connection. Historical records from medieval European towns show that market days were fiercely protected and regulated. A town might have the right to hold a market 1 day a week, granted by the local lord or king, and that day was sacred. Other nearby towns were not allowed to hold their markets on the same day because it would create competition. Each town had its designated day, and everyone knew it. Eleanor's town had Saturday. The next town over had Wednesday, another had Thursday. And here is what is fascinating. People structured their entire lives around these market days. A woman would not think, it is October 15th. She would think, it is 2 market days after Michaelmas, which was a feast day on September 29th. Or, it is the 3rd Saturday of the harvest season. Time was measured in markets. Imagine trying to make plans with someone. You could not say, meet me at 3 o'clock on Tuesday the 16th. You would say, "Meet me at the next market day when the sun is high," and everyone understood. Everyone was working from the same calendar, the community calendar. But markets were just the beginning, because beyond the weekly market there were the fairs. These were much larger events that happened a few times a year. A fair might last 3 days, a week, even longer. Merchants from distant places would come. Exotic goods would be available. Entertainment, music, performers, and thousands of people would gather. For women, fairs were huge events. They required weeks of preparation. If you were going to sell goods at the fair, you had to produce extra. Save up, plan ahead. Eleanor might spend the entire month before the autumn fair spinning extra thread, weaving extra cloth, collecting extra eggs, because the fair was where you could make real money, where you could sell in volume, where you could buy things that were not available at the weekly market. And fairs also served as major time markers. The year was divided not just by seasons, but by fairs. The spring fair, the midsummer fair, the harvest fair, the winter fair. Each one marked the passage of time in a way that was tangible, memorable, significant. There are surviving account books from medieval households that record expenses by fair. Purchased at the Michaelmas Fair, 3 ells of woolen cloth, 1 iron pot, 6 needles, spices. The fair itself was the date, the reference point, the way time was recorded. And here is something beautiful. Fairs were also where news travelled. Remember, there were no newspapers, no internet, no phone calls. If you wanted to know what was happening in the wider world, you had to talk to people. And fairs brought people from all over. Merchants who had travelled from distant cities. Pilgrims who had been to holy sites. Soldiers returning from wars. They brought stories, information, gossip, and women would drink it all in. Eleanor might hear at the autumn fair there had been a bad harvest 2 regions over, which explained why grain prices were higher, or that a new king had been crowned, or that a plague had broken out in a distant city. This information was not just interesting, it was practical. It helped her make decisions. Should she sell her grain now or hold on to it? Should she buy extra preserves while they were available? But beyond the economic and informational functions, fairs and markets served another critical purpose. They created shared memories. They created stories that could be referred to later. Remember the fair where it rained so hard everyone's goods got soaked? Remember the market day when that travelling performer had the dancing bear? These became touchstones, shared reference points, a way for a community to mark time together. Do you see how different this is from our modern experience? We mark time individually. We look at our personal calendars. We track our own schedules. We might not have any shared temporal reference points with our neighbours. You might celebrate your birthday, I might celebrate mine. We might not have any overlap. But in Eleanor's world, everyone was marking time together. Everyone went to the same market. Everyone attended the same fair. Everyone experienced the same communal rhythm. And this created a sense of solidarity, a sense of we are all in this together. Time is not just something I'm moving through alone. It is something we are moving through it as a community. Religious festivals added another layer to this communal calendar. And for women, these were some of the most important markers of the year. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, the Feast of the Assumption, All Saints' Day. Each one came with specific preparations, specific traditions, specific foods that had to be made. Let me tell you about a woman named Margherita, living in a village in Italy in the year 1500. The Christian calendar structures her entire year. Lent, the 40 days before Easter, is a time of fasting and simplicity. Margherita eats no meat during Lent. She serves her family simple meals. Fish, if they can afford it, beans and vegetables, bread. It is a time of restraint, of reflection, of waiting. But then Easter arrives, and everything explodes into celebration. Margarita has been saving eggs for weeks because no one ate them during Lent. Now she uses them to make rich cakes and pastries. She roasts a leg of lamb if her family can afford it. She decorates her home with spring flowers. The whole village goes to church together. There is singing, joy, relief. The long fast is over. Spring has truly arrived. For Margarita, Easter is not just a religious observance. It is a temporal marker of immense significance. It divides the year. There is the time before Easter and the time after Easter. She might say, "My daughter was born 3 weeks after Easter 2 years ago," or "We need to finish that task before Easter comes." The festival gives shape to time, and each festival had its own character, its own feeling. Christmas was about warmth and light in the darkest part of winter. Candlelight, fires burning bright, rich food saved for this special time, stories told, carols sung. It was a moment of defiance against the cold and dark, a celebration of hope. The Feast of St. John, celebrated at the summer solstice, was about abundance, the longest day of the year. Everything growing, everything alive. Communities would light bonfires, dance, celebrate the peak of light before the slow descent back into winter. Harvest festivals, which varied by region and crop, were about gratitude and relief. We made it. We have food. We will survive another winter. These festivals often involved entire communities coming together to feast on the first fruits of the harvest, to thank God, to acknowledge the hard work that had brought them to this moment. For women, preparing for these festivals was a massive undertaking. Special foods had to be made, foods that were only eaten on that particular day. Traditions had to be honoured. And in doing this preparation, in following these traditions, women were not just cooking, they were participating in timekeeping. They were marking the calendar. They were saying, this is where we are in the year. This is who we are as a community. There is a medieval English text that describes the preparations for Christmas. It lists everything that needed to be done. The house cleaned thoroughly, special breads baked, meat preserved in a particular way, ale brewed weeks in advance. The text makes it clear that these preparations began right after the autumn harvest. Months of work leading up to one important day. And the beauty of this is that it gave women a sense of control over time. Yes, they could not control the sun or the seasons, but they could control the preparations. They could make sure everything was ready. They could create the conditions for the festival to be meaningful, and in doing so they were not passive recipients of time passing. They were active participants in creating the rhythm of the year. Now let me tell you about something that might surprise you. In many communities, women had their own festivals, gatherings that were women only. These were not always religious. Sometimes they were economic, sometimes they were social, but they served a crucial function. They created a separate women's calendar within the larger community calendar. In some parts of medieval Europe, there was a tradition of women gathering on the feast of St. Agatha, the patron saint of women. On this day, men were expected to stay home and do the household work while women went out, gathered together, drank, talked, laughed. It was a complete reversal of normal roles, and it was sanctioned, expected, part of the calendar. These women-only gatherings gave women space to share knowledge, to complain about their husbands in a safe setting, to form alliances, to support one another, and they also served as temporal markers. I last saw my cousin at the St. Agatha gathering. My daughter was just learning to walk at the last women's feast. Think about what this means. Women were creating their own markers within time, their own reference points, not waiting for men or the church or the market to tell them when important moments were, but claiming certain days as theirs, as women's time. And this is powerful, this is agency, this is women saying, we also get to mark the calendar, we also get to create the rhythm, we also matter in the measurement of time. So what can we learn from this? What does the community calendar teach us? I think it teaches us that time is better when it is shared, that there is something profoundly human about marking moments together, about having collective celebrations, about moving through the year as a community, not just as isolated individuals. And maybe it teaches us that we have lost something important. How many of us have strong community calendars anymore? Do you have regular gatherings with your neighbours? Do you have festivals that everyone attends? Do you have shared markers that structure your year? Or are we all just moving through time alone, checking our individual digital calendars, trying to coordinate schedules that never quite align? Maybe we need to reclaim some of this. Maybe we need to create shared rhythms again. Community potlucks, neighbourhood gatherings, seasonal celebrations. Not because we need to recreate medieval life, but because we need what those gatherings provided. Connection, shared memory, a sense that we are not alone in time, that we are moving through it together. But even the strongest community calendar, even the most joyful festivals, all paled in comparison to one particular timekeeper in a woman's life. One that was more personal than any market day, more powerful than any feast. One that measured time not in days or weeks or even months, but in the rhythm of bodies growing, changing, needing. One that taught women a kind of time that had nothing to do with clocks and everything to do with life itself. And that is where we turn next. To the children, to the babies, to the heartbeat of time that lives in the curve of a mother's arms. The cry pierced through sleep, urgent, demanding, impossible to ignore. And before she was even fully awake, she was moving, reaching for the infant, bringing the baby to her breast. Not because a clock told her it was feeding time, not because a schedule said 2 hours had passed, but because the baby cried. The baby was hungry, and that cry was the only clock that mattered. Welcome to perhaps the most demanding, most relentless, most utterly consuming form of timekeeping a woman has ever known. Parenting. And in a world without schedules, without pediatrician charts, without apps tracking feedings and sleep, parenting created its own wild, unpredictable, beautiful rhythm. A rhythm dictated entirely by the needs of small, helpless humans who could not tell time and did not care. Let me take you into the life of a new mother. Her name is Catherine. She lives in London in the year 1600. She is 22 years old and has just given birth to her first child, a daughter. The baby is 3 days old, and Catherine is discovering something that every new mother throughout history has discovered. Time no longer exists, not in any way she previously understood it. Before the baby, Catherine's days had structure. She woke at dawn, she prepared breakfast, she did her household tasks according to a rhythm she had learned from her mother. She ate the midday meal, she worked through the afternoon, she prepared supper, she went to bed after dark. Simple, predictable, manageable. Now there is only the baby who has no concept of dawn or dusk, no understanding of meal times or work hours, no respect whatsoever for Catherine's need to sleep or eat or accomplish anything. The baby operates on a completely different temporal system, one that Catherine must learn, must adapt to, must surrender to. The baby cries. Catherine feeds her. This takes perhaps 30 minutes, sometimes 45. The baby falls asleep at the breast. Catherine carefully, oh so carefully, tries to lay the baby down. The baby wakes immediately, cries. Catherine picks her up again, rocks her, walks with her. Eventually, finally, the baby sleeps. Catherine lays her down. Success. Catherine has perhaps an hour, maybe 2 if she is lucky. She uses this time frantically, trying to eat something herself, trying to use the chamber pot, trying to change her own clothing which is soaked with milk and sweat. And then the baby wakes, the baby cries, and it starts again. There is no schedule, there is no every 3 hours like modern parenting books might suggest. There is only the baby's need, right now, always right now. How does Catherine know when to feed the baby? The baby tells her. How does Catherine know when the baby needs to sleep? The baby tells her, usually by screaming with exhaustion. How does Catherine know anything? She learns to read the signals, the tiny cues, the different kinds of cries, the way the baby roots around when hungry, the way her little fists rub her eyes when tired. The baby becomes Catherine's clock. The baby dictates every moment. And this is not just for the first few days, this goes on for months. Historical records and letters from women throughout different time periods describe the exhaustion of early motherhood in remarkably similar terms. A letter from a woman in colonial America describes being utterly depleted, unable to tell if it is night or day, existing only to meet the endless needs of my infant. But here is what is remarkable. Women adapted. They found ways to survive this temporal chaos, and one of the primary ways was through responsive parenting. They did not try to impose a schedule on the baby. They could not. They had no way to track time precisely enough. Instead, they responded to the baby's needs as they arose. The baby is hungry now, feed now. The baby needs comfort now, the baby's finally sleeping. Rest now yourself, because who knows when the next wake-up will be. This is actually much closer to how modern attachment parenting works than the rigid scheduling approaches that became popular in the 20th century. Women in the past were, by necessity, practicing responsive parenting, and research now shows that this approach, responding to a baby's cues rather than watching a clock, often leads to more secure attachment and actually, ironically, more predictable patterns emerging naturally over time. But let me be clear, this was not easy. This was not some idyllic natural paradise. This was exhausting, depleting, often lonely. Catherine's mother might come help for a few weeks after the birth, or a sister, or a neighbour. But eventually Catherine was on her own with this tiny, demanding creature who had completely upended her understanding of time. And beyond the immediate needs of a newborn, children continued to serve as timekeepers as they grew, because women measured their lives by their children's growth. Let me introduce you to Hannah, a woman living in ancient Egypt around 1400, before the Common Era. Hannah has 3 children. The eldest is perhaps 7 years old. The middle child is 4. The youngest is still nursing, maybe 18 months old. If you ask Hannah when something happened, she does not reference a year or a date. She references her children. That happened when my eldest was still small enough to carry. Or, that was during the time I was pregnant with my middle child. Or, that was after my youngest was weaned but before my eldest lost her first tooth. Children's developmental milestones became temporal markers the first time they rolled over, the first time they sat up, first words, first steps, first teeth. Each milestone was noted, remembered, used as a reference point. And because every mother knew roughly what age these milestones happened, they could use them to estimate time. My neighbour's child was born around the same time mine started walking, meant the neighbour's child was roughly a year younger. You could calculate relationships between events by mapping them onto children's growth. And pregnancy itself was, as we discussed earlier, a major unit of time, 9 moons. But let me tell you something that might surprise you. Women did not always know exactly when they conceived. They might not realize they were pregnant for the first few months. So when did the counting start? Often it started when they felt the quickening, the first movements of the baby. This usually happens around the 4th or 5th month of pregnancy. So a woman might say, "I felt the quickening 3 moons ago," which means the baby will come in about 4 or 5 more moons. It was not precise, but it was good enough. And when the baby finally arrived, the moment of birth became a new marker. Everything was now measured in relation to that baby. This happened when the baby was still small. That happened when the baby was nearly walking. Having multiple children created layers of temporal markers. A woman with 5 children could pinpoint events with remarkable accuracy by cross-referencing their ages. That winter was when my eldest was learning to help with the weaving. My second was just old enough to carry water. My third was still nursing, and I was pregnant with my 4th. That is a very specific window of time, even without a single date or number. There is a medieval English will that has been preserved in which a woman bequeaths different items to her children and grandchildren, and the way she identifies them is fascinating, not by birth years, but by describing their ages in relation to each other and to events. My granddaughter, born in the year of the Great Flood, who is now of marrying age. My son, who was born when his father was away at war. These descriptions were meaningful to everyone in the family. They knew exactly who she was talking about. But parenting without schedules was not just about tracking time. It was also about structuring time. Children's needs created a natural rhythm. Babies needed to be fed frequently. Young children needed to be watched constantly. Older children could help with tasks but needed instruction and supervision. And all of this work had to be woven into the other demands of running a household. Let me tell you how a woman in colonial America might structure her day around her children. Her name is Prudence. She has 4 children. The eldest is 10. The youngest is 2. Prudence wakes at dawn. Before she does anything else, she nurses the 2-year-old, who still wakes hungry in the morning. While nursing, she instructs her 10-year-old daughter to start the fire and her 8-year-old son to fetch water. Once the youngest is fed, Prudence begins preparing breakfast. Her 6-year-old daughter helps, learning by watching and doing simple tasks. Breakfast is eaten together. Then the older children are sent out to do their chores. The 10-year-old goes with her father to work in the fields. The 8-year-old tends the animals. The 6-year-old stays with Prudence to help with indoor work. Throughout the day, Prudence is constantly balancing tasks. She needs to prepare food. She needs to supervise the 6-year-old. She needs to keep an eye on the 2-year-old who is into everything. She cannot focus on one task for long stretches. Instead, she moves fluidly between them, stirring the pot, showing her daughter how to knead bread, pulling the toddler away from the fire, nursing when the toddler demands it, sending the older children to do errands, checking on their work, correcting, teaching, feeding, cleaning, constantly adapting. There is no schedule in the modern sense, but there is rhythm, there is flow, and Prudence knows this rhythm intimately. She knows that the toddler will need to nurse roughly every 2 to 3 hours. She knows that the 6-year-old can focus on a task for maybe 30 minutes before getting distracted. She knows that the older children will return from their chores hungry and tired. She plans around these knowns, but she also remains flexible. Because children are unpredictable, one might get hurt, one might get sick. Plans change constantly. And here is what I find beautiful. This kind of parenting taught flexibility in a way that our modern scheduled parenting often does not. Prudence could not afford to be rigid. She could not say, nap time is at 1 o'clock and we are sticking to it no matter what. Because she did not have a 1 o'clock. She had when the toddler gets tired, which might be slightly different each day. And she learned to read the signs, to respond, to adapt. This is not to romanticize historical parenting. Child mortality was high. Medical care was limited. Women lost children and carried that grief their entire lives. The past was hard, often brutally hard. But there was also wisdom in the flexibility, in the responsiveness, in the understanding that children are not machines that can be programmed to a schedule. They are humans with their own rhythms. Let me share something from a historical child-rearing manual from the 1700s. It advises mothers to be guided by the child's natural inclinations. Do not force the child to eat when it is not hungry. Do not force the child to sleep when it is not tired. Observe the child. Learn its ways. And work with them, not against them. This is remarkably modern advice, and yet it is hundreds of years old. Because mothers have always known when they are allowed to listen to their instincts, rather than to rigid external rules, that children tell you what they need. You just have to pay attention. Now, as children grew older, they themselves became markers of time in another way. They represented the future, a woman's legacy, a way her life would continue beyond her own death. In cultures where life expectancy was short, where many women died in childbirth or from disease, children were a form of immortality. They would carry forward the mother's teachings, her skills, her stories. There are accounts of elderly women in medieval Europe who would gather children and teach them songs, rhymes, prayers, stories, and these children would carry those forward to the next generation. The grandmother might not live to see her great-grandchildren, but her great-grandchildren would sing the song she taught. Time stretched across generations, held together by the threads of what mothers taught their children. And here is something that moves me deeply. In many cultures, a woman's age was sometimes calculated by her children rather than by years. She might be mother of 3 or mother of many. Her identity, her place in the community, her status, all related to her children. This can feel limiting to modern sensibilities, but it also meant that motherhood was recognized as significant work, time-consuming work, important work. A woman with many children had invested decades of her life in raising them. That was acknowledged, honored, even if it was not always valued in economic terms. So what do we learn from children as clocks? What wisdom can we take from this? I think we learn that the most important rhythms are often the least measurable, that love and care cannot be scheduled, that the work of raising humans requires a kind of presence that clocks cannot capture, that sometimes the best thing we can do is put away the schedule and just be with the person in front of us, responding to what they need right now. And maybe we learn that it is okay for time to feel chaotic, especially when we are caring for small children. We are not failing if we do not stick to the schedule. We are not failing if every day is different. We are actually doing it right. We are responding. We are adapting. We are being human. But even as women poured their lives into children, even as babies dictated days and growth marked years, a change was coming. A mechanical change, a revolution that would transform time itself. Somewhere in a monastery tower, somewhere in a town square, a new sound was beginning. Not the soft cry of a baby, not the gentle whir of a spinning wheel, but the harsh, precise tick of gears and wheels. The mechanical clock was coming, and it would change everything, including what it meant to be a woman trying to organize her day. Tick, tick, tick. A new sound in the world, cold, precise, mechanical. Nothing like the organic rhythms that had governed human life for millennia. Not the crow of a rooster, not the ring of a church bell, not the cry of a baby, but a mechanism, gears turning, weights falling, a machine measuring time with an indifference that felt almost hostile to the warm, flexible, responsive way women had been organizing their lives. The mechanical clock arrived in Europe in the 1300s, and at first it seemed like a miracle, a marvel of engineering, a triumph of human ingenuity. Finally, time could be measured with precision. Finally, everyone could know exactly what hour it was. Finally, there would be no confusion, no approximation, no guesswork. But for women, the mechanical clock was not just a helpful tool, it was a threat, a judgment, a new master that would fundamentally change their relationship with time and with their own work. Let me take you to a monastery in the year 1320. High in a tower, monks have installed one of the first mechanical clocks in Europe. It is enormous, powered by heavy weights that must be wound regularly. It has no minute hand, just an hour hand, and it strikes a bell on the hour. That bell can be heard throughout the monastery and into the surrounding countryside. The monks are thrilled. Now they can wake for their nighttime prayers at exactly the right time. Now they can structure their day with unprecedented precision. Now they can organize their work, their worship, their entire communal life according to this reliable mechanical timekeeper. But in the village below the monastery, a woman stands in her doorway and listens to the new clock strike. Her name is Johanna, and she feels something she cannot quite name, something like unease, because that clock, ticking away in the tower, measuring time in equal invariable hours, does not care about the rhythms of her life. It does not care that her baby is sick and she's been up all night. It does not care that the bread is not quite finished rising. It does not care that she needs just a bit more time to complete her task. The clock ticks forward, indifferent, relentless, and Johanna realizes that something fundamental is shifting. Before the mechanical clock, time had been flexible. Seasonal hours meant that a summer daylight hour was longer than a winter daylight hour. This made sense. It aligned with the natural world. It allowed people to work with the light they had. But mechanical clocks divided the day into 24 equal hours, regardless of season. Each hour was exactly the same length. Summer or winter, day or night, 60 minutes. No variation. At first, this change was just a curiosity. The mechanical clocks were rare, expensive, found only in wealthy monasteries and town halls. Most people's lives continued as before, governed by the sun and the bells and the natural rhythms. But gradually, over the course of the 14 and 1500s, mechanical clocks became more common. Towns installed them in public squares, churches adopted them, and slowly a new concept of time began to take hold. Measured time, abstract time, time divorced from the natural world. And here is where it gets interesting and tragic for women. Because the work that women did, the work of caring for homes and children and the daily needs of families, this work did not fit neatly into measured hours. It was responsive work, flexible work, work that expanded and contracted based on need, not on the clock. But as mechanical time became dominant, as society began to structure itself around the clock, a division emerged. Men's work, which increasingly happened outside the home in workshops, fields organized for efficiency, and eventually factories, could be measured in hours. I worked from sunrise to sunset. I worked 8 hours. I earned a day's wage. It was quantifiable. It fit the clock. But women's work? How do you measure an hour of childcare? If a child needs comfort, you cannot say, "Sorry, your hour is up." How do you measure the time it takes to nurse a baby? It takes as long as it takes. How do you measure the value of being available, being present, being responsive? You cannot. And so women's work began to be seen as less real, less valuable, because it could not be measured by the clock. Let me tell you about a shift that happened in the 15 and 1600s. Before this time, both men and women worked primarily in or near the home. A craftsman's workshop might be attached to his house. His wife and children would help with the work. Time was shared. The rhythm of work and family life were intertwined. But as mechanical clocks became more common, and as capitalism began to develop, work started to move away from the home, to separate workshops, to factories, to offices, and this created a split. Men left home to go to work where time was measured and productivity was tracked. Women stayed home to do housework, which was increasingly not considered real work at all because it could not be measured, could not be timed, could not be valued in the same way. There is a heartbreaking quote from a 1500 English text written by a merchant explaining why he pays his male apprentices but not his wife, even though she works in the shop alongside him. He says, "The boy works by the clock. He comes at the appointed hour. He leaves at the appointed hour. I can measure his labour, but my wife, she is always here. Her work has no beginning and no end. How can I assign value to that which cannot be measured?" Do you see what happened? The clock did not just measure time, it determined value. And because women's work did not conform to the clock, it was devalued, made invisible, treated as if it were not work at all. And this had real consequences. As economies became more monetized, as wages became the primary form of compensation, women who worked in their homes raising children and managing households had no wages. Their work was unpaid, and therefore in the emerging economic system it was worthless. Now let me be very clear. This is not a story about the mechanical clock being evil. Technology is neutral. It is how we use it, how we structure our societies around it that creates harm or benefit. The problem was not the clock itself. The problem was a society that decided only measurable, quantifiable, clockable work had value. But the clock did something else too, something more subtle. It changed the way people experienced time. Before the mechanical clock, time was something you inhabited. You were in the morning. You were in the season of harvest. You were in the time of raising young children. Time was a space you moved through, a context you existed within. After the mechanical clock, time became something you used, something you spent, something you saved. Time became a commodity, and if time is a commodity, then wasting it is a sin. Idleness becomes immoral. Rest becomes suspicious. Every moment must be productive, must be used, must be accounted for. For women, this created an impossible standard. Because the work of caring, the work of being present, often looks like not doing anything. A mother sitting with a feverish child. What is she producing? Nothing measurable. A woman pausing in her work to comfort a crying neighbour. What value does that have? It cannot be timed. It cannot be billed. It does not contribute to the measurable economy. And yet this work is essential. It is the work that holds communities together, that raises children, that tends to the sick and elderly, that maintains the fabric of human connection. But the clock does not measure it. And what the clock does not measure, the modern world does not value. There is a term that historians use, the Industrious Revolution. This happened in the 16 and 1700s, before the Industrial Revolution. It was a shift in how people thought about work and time. People began to work longer hours, more intensively, squeezing more productivity out of each day. Why? Because the clock made it possible to measure productivity. And what can be measured can be compared. And what can be compared creates competition. And competition drives people to work harder, longer, faster. Men increasingly worked by the clock, but women were caught in a terrible bind. They were expected to maintain the old rhythms, the responsive caregiving, the flexible household management. But they were also increasingly judged by clock time, expected to have meals ready at precise hours, expected to maintain spotless homes, expected to raise perfect children, all while doing work that fundamentally could not be done according to a rigid schedule. And if they failed to meet these impossible standards, they were called lazy. inefficient, bad housewives. The clock became a tool of judgment against women. Let me tell you about a court case from 1650 in England. A woman is sued by her husband for wasting his resources because she does not manage the household efficiently enough. His evidence: he has started keeping a log of how she spends her time. He writes, "On Tuesday she spent 2 hours preparing the midday meal, when it should have taken only 1 hour. On Wednesday she spent 90 minutes settling a dispute between the children when she should have been weaving." The court astonishingly takes his side. They rule that she is indeed wasting time and must reform her ways. This is what the mechanical clock did. It gave men a tool to measure and judge women's work. Work that had always been done according to need, according to the rhythms of life, was now expected to conform to the rigid ticking of the clock, and women were found wanting. But there is another side to this story, because women did not just passively accept this new temporal regime. They resisted. They adapted. They found ways to survive and even thrive in a world increasingly dominated by clock time. Some women became experts at time management in ways that would impress even the most efficient modern professional. There are household management books written by women in the 1700s and 1800s that are astonishingly detailed. They create schedules that assign specific tasks to specific hours. Monday is washing day. Tuesday is ironing day. Wednesday is baking day. They did this not because they loved the clock, but because they realized that if they were going to be judged by clock time, they needed to master it. Other women created alternative economies. They did work that could be measured and paid for, taking in laundry, sewing for others, selling eggs and butter, not because they wanted to abandon their household work, but because they needed the recognition and value that came with measurable paid labour. And some women, particularly working-class women who had to work outside the home in factories and workshops, found themselves living in two temporal systems simultaneously. Clock time at work, where every minute was monitored. Flexible, responsive time at home, where children did not care what the clock said. These women became expert at switching between modes, at being one person at work and another person at home. It was exhausting, it still is, because here is the truth. We still live in this system. We still value measurable work over unmeasurable care. We still act as if time spent in an office, tracked by a clock, is more real than time spent raising a child or caring for an aging parent. We still struggle with the same questions women struggled with 500 years ago. How do you value work that cannot be timed? How do you honour rhythms that do not conform to schedules? And here is the saddest part. The mechanical clock promised liberation, promised precision, promised control over time, but for women it often meant the opposite. It meant their work became invisible. It meant they lost the flexibility and autonomy they once had. It meant they were held to impossible standards. It meant time became a master instead of a tool. So what do we do with this knowledge? How do we move forward? I do not think we can or should abandon clocks. They serve important functions. They allow coordination. They enable modern life. But maybe we can question the assumption that only clock time is real time. Maybe we can start valuing and compensating care work the way we value and compensate other forms of labour. Maybe we can remember that humans are not machines, that some of the most important work we do cannot be measured in hours, that presence, care, love, these things operate on a different temporal scale, and that is okay, that is good, that is human. The mechanical clock changed the world, there is no doubt about that. But it did not have to devalue women's work. That was a choice our societies made. And choices can be unmade, systems can be changed, values can be shifted. As the clock ticked away the centuries, as mechanical time became electrical time, became digital time, as precision increased, and the whole world synchronized to atomic clocks accurate to billionths of a second, women continued to do what they had always done. They organized their days, they responded to needs, they created rhythm and structure and meaning out of the raw material of time. But they also began to ask questions, to push back, to demand recognition. And in our final moments together, we will explore what we can learn from this entire journey. What wisdom can we carry forward from the women who organized their days by the sun and the moon and their bodies and their children? What have we lost? What can we reclaim? That is where we go now, to the lessons, to the wisdom, to the possibility of a different relationship with time. So here we are, at the end of a journey that has taken us from sunlit fields to moonlit nights, from spinning wheels to church towers, from the cry of newborns to the tick of mechanical clocks. We have walked alongside women who lived centuries ago, women who organized their entire lives without ever once checking the time on a phone. And now the question is, what do we do with all of this? What can we, living in our hyper-scheduled, overclocked, constantly buzzing modern world, learn from these women? Let me start by saying this. I am not here to tell you to throw away your smartphone and live by candlelight. I am not suggesting we return to a pre-industrial existence. That would be absurd. And honestly, life was hard back then, really hard. Child mortality was high, medical care was primitive, women died in childbirth, winters were brutal. I am not romanticizing the past, but I am suggesting that in our rush toward precision and productivity and perfect time management, we have lost something valuable, something essential, and maybe, just maybe, we can find it again. The first lesson is this. Your body knows things your calendar does not. Remember the infradian rhythm, that 28-day cycle that affects women's energy, mood, creativity, everything. That rhythm is still there, still operating, whether you track it or not, whether you honor it or not. Your body is still moving through those phases. High energy, peak performance, need for rest, need for renewal. The cycle continues. The question is, are you listening? There is a growing movement of women, particularly in wellness and productivity circles, who are rediscovering what their ancestors knew instinctively. They call it cycle syncing. The idea is simple. Instead of trying to maintain the same energy and productivity every single day of the month, you adjust your work and life to match your natural rhythms. During the follicular phase, when estrogen is rising and energy is high, you schedule your most challenging work, your big presentations, your creative projects, your intense social events. During the luteal phase, when progesterone is dominant and energy is lower, you focus on completion, on administrative tasks, on rest, on turning inward. And here is what women who practice this report. They feel less exhausted, less like they are constantly fighting against themselves, less guilt about the days when they just do not have the energy they think they should have, because they understand now that energy naturally fluctuates, and that is not a flaw, that is biology, that is being human, that is being a woman. So here is my first invitation to you. Start paying attention to your cycle, not obsessively, not with some complicated tracking system unless that appeals to you. Just notice, how do you feel at different times of the month? When do you have the most energy? When do you need more rest? When is your creativity flowing? When do you feel more introspective? And then, if you can, if your schedule allows even a little flexibility, try working with that rhythm instead of against it. See what happens. I think you might be surprised. The second lesson is about seasons. We talked about how women in the past structured their entire year around seasonal rhythms. Spring for planting, summer for tending, autumn for harvesting, winter for rest and preparation, and how modern life has flattened all of that. We eat strawberries in December. We keep our homes at 70 degrees year-round. We work at the same pace every month. We have lost the seasonal variation, and I think we have lost something important with it. Because just like our bodies have natural cycles, the Earth has natural cycles, and we are part of the Earth. We evolved to move through seasons, to have times of intense activity and times of rest, to align our internal rhythms with external rhythms. And when we try to maintain the same pace year-round, we exhaust ourselves. We burn out. Now I know what you might be thinking, but I have to work year-round. I cannot just rest all winter like a medieval peasant. And you are right. Most of us cannot make dramatic seasonal changes to our schedules. But we can make small shifts. We can notice the seasons. We can spend more time outdoors in different seasons. We can eat seasonally when possible. We can adjust our exercise routines. Maybe more intense outdoor activities in summer. More gentle restorative practices in winter. We can even adjust our work if we have any control over it. Saving the big creative projects for spring when everything feels fresh. Focusing on completion and wrapping up in autumn. Using winter for learning, planning, preparing. The point is not to perfectly replicate historical seasonal living. The point is to remember that we are seasonal creatures. That variation is natural, that rest is not laziness. It is part of the cycle. And when we honor that, we work better, we live better, we feel better. The third lesson is about presence. Remember how women in the past measured time by tasks, how long it takes the bread to rise, how long it takes to walk to the well 3 times, how long it takes to spin a distaff of wool. They were not watching a clock. They were engaged with the work itself. They were present. And presence, it turns out, is one of the things we have lost most completely in our modern world. How often do you do something while simultaneously checking your phone, watching TV, thinking about the next task? We are almost never fully present anymore. We are always divided, always multitasking, always half here and half somewhere else, and it is making us miserable. Research on attention and well-being shows that people are happiest when they are fully engaged in what they are doing, not when they are thinking about what they should be doing next, not when they are worried about whether they are using their time efficiently, but when they are simply fully, completely present. So here is my second invitation. Pick one task each day, just one, and do it with full presence. Maybe it is making your morning coffee, maybe it is taking a shower, maybe it is eating one meal. Whatever it is, do it without your phone, without multitasking. Just be there. Notice the sensations, the smells, the textures, the experience of being alive in that moment. Do this every day for a week and see if it changes anything. I think it will. The fourth lesson is about community. Remember the market days, the festivals, the gatherings where entire communities move through time together. We have lost so much of that. We are all on our own schedules now, our own individual timelines. Coordinating with others is a logistical nightmare, and we are lonely, desperately lonely, even when we are constantly connected digitally. What would it look like to create shared rhythms again? What if you and your friends committed to a weekly gathering? Same time, same day, every week, no matter what. Not because you need a reason, not because you're celebrating anything, just because it is the day you gather. What if your neighborhood had a monthly potluck? What if your community had seasonal festivals? Not elaborate productions, just simple gatherings, a spring picnic, a summer barbecue, an autumn bonfire, a winter gathering. Creating shared rhythms creates shared memories, creates connection, creates the sense that we are moving through time together, not alone. And that matters. That might matter more than almost anything else. The fifth and final lesson is about unmeasured time. about the work that cannot be quantified, the care that cannot be clocked, the presence that cannot be scheduled. We talked about how the mechanical clock devalued women's work because it could not be measured, and how that devaluation continues today. Care work, emotional labour, the constant background hum of managing a household, raising children, maintaining relationships, all of it unpaid or underpaid, all of it invisible in our economic systems. But here is what I want you to know. The fact that it cannot be measured does not mean it does not have value. In fact, it might mean the opposite. Maybe the most valuable things in life are precisely the things that cannot be quantified. Love, connection, beauty, presence, care, these things do not fit on a spreadsheet. They do not contribute to gross domestic product. They cannot be optimized or made more efficient. And that is okay, that is good, that is what makes them precious. So here is my final invitation. Stop trying to measure everything. Stop trying to optimize every moment. Stop feeling guilty about time that is not productive in a measurable way. The time you spend comforting a friend, the time you spend staring out the window, the time you spend playing with a child, the time you spend just being. That time is not wasted. That time is life. That time is what we are here for. And if anyone, if any system, if any voice in your head tells you that unmeasured time is worthless time, you tell them they are wrong. You tell them they have mistaken the map for the territory, the measurement for the thing itself. You tell them that you know better, because you have travelled back through history with women who organised their days without clocks, and you have learned what they knew. That time is not money, time is not a resource to be extracted and exploited. Time is the medium in which we live, the water we swim in, the air we breathe, and the most sacred use of time is not productivity, it is presence, it is connection, it is love. Let me tell you one more story, a modern story. There is a woman I know, let us call her Sarah. She is a successful professional. She has a demanding job, 2 kids, a partner, a busy life, and she was drowning, constantly behind, constantly exhausted, constantly feeling like she was failing at everything. She read all the time management books. She tried all the productivity hacks. Nothing worked. She just kept feeling worse. And then she did something radical. She stopped trying to manage her time. She stopped scheduling every minute. She stopped feeling guilty about the hours that could not be accounted for. Instead, she started listening to her body, to her children, to the seasons, to her own needs. She started saying no to things that did not align with her rhythms. She started building in rest, not as a reward of her productivity, but as a necessary part of the cycle. She started working with her menstrual cycle instead of pretending it did not exist. She started eating seasonally. She started creating weekly rhythms with her family. Sunday pancakes, Wednesday game night, Friday movie night, simple, predictable, comforting. And you know what happened? Her life got better. Not perfect, not effortless, but better. She felt more connected, more present, more herself. She was not more productive, not by any measurable standard, but she was happier. And is that not the point? Is that not what all of this is supposed to be about? The women we have met tonight, from ancient Egypt to medieval England to colonial America, they were not trying to be productive. They were trying to survive, to care for their families, to live in harmony with the world around them. And in doing so, they developed a wisdom about time that we desperately need to rediscover. They knew that time is not linear, it is cyclical. They knew that not all hours are equal. They knew that rest is not optional. They knew that the most important work often cannot be measured. They knew that community and connection matter more than efficiency. And they organized their days accordingly, not perfectly, not without struggle, but with a flexibility, a responsiveness, a presence that we have lost. And I believe we can find it again. Not by rejecting modernity, not by throwing away our clocks, but by remembering that the clock is a tool, not a master, that we get to decide how we relate to time, that we get to honor our rhythms, our needs, our humanity. As we come to the end of this long night's journey, as dawn approaches wherever you are in the world, I want to leave you with this. You are not a machine. You're a human being with natural rhythms and cycles and needs that do not fit neatly into a schedule, and that is not a flaw. That is not something to fix or overcome. That is your nature. That is your wisdom. That is your inheritance from thousands of generations of women who organize their days by the sun and the moon and their bodies and their children and their communities. Listen to that wisdom. Trust it, even when the world tells you to ignore it, even when productivity culture tells you to optimize and hustle and never rest. You know better. Deep in your bones, in your cells, in the ancient memory that lives in your body, you know better. The sun is still the sun, the moon is still the moon. Your body still moves through its rhythms. Children still need what children need. Bread still takes the time it takes to rise. And you are still part of this ancient dance between humans and time. You always have been. You always will be. Thank you for taking this journey with me tonight. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. I know your time is precious. I know you had a million other things you could have been doing, and you chose to be here, listening to stories about women and time. That means something. That matters. I hope these stories have given you something useful, something that shifts how you think about your own days, your own rhythms, your own relationship with time, and I hope you will carry some of this wisdom forward into your life, into your choices, into the way you organize your days. And please, if these stories resonated with you, if you found value in this journey, share it. Tell someone, not because I need you to, but because these stories deserve to be heard. This wisdom deserves to be remembered. Women's experiences deserve to be honored. And the more we talk about these things, the more we question the tyranny of the clock, the more we reclaim our natural rhythms, the more we create space for a different way of being, together. There are more stories to tell, more journeys to take, more wisdom waiting to be rediscovered, and I will be here, ready to explore them with you. So until next time, wherever you are, whatever time it is on your clock, I hope you rest well. I hope you wake gently. I hope you move through your days with a little more grace, a little more presence, a little more trust in your own rhythms. You deserve that. You really do. Good night, or good morning, or good afternoon. Wherever you are in the circle of time, I wish you well.